Good evening, everybody.
Hey, Brian.
Hi there, guys.
What is
Hello,
happening?
hello.
Welcome, Dr. Peck.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited for the chat tonight. So, I thought what we might do is go around and whether people know more or less like the context of where we're at as far as beekeeping, hobbyist, commercial, give a little bit of a background of who we are. So, and that way, if there's viewers also that are here that aren't regularly on our streams, they know who each of us are. So, I can go ahead and mine is the easiest, I think, because I am the hobbyist beekeeper that has just a couple colonies. I currently have 11 colonies. Everybody in here feels that I'm going to probably have 30 or 40 this next year. I don't know. You'll see various hashtags throughout the chat tonight that say hashtag Brian 20, hashtag. But I like that intimate relationship with the colonies. That's why I stay grounded. Here's one right here. We got Bruce is starting it too. So I see the hashtags. But that's why I stay grounded where I'm at as the hobbyist, is just because if I want to walk out into my apiary and sit there, and when I pull up that frame and I see that gorgeous queen, I want to sit and stare at her for even 5 or 10 minutes. If she starts laying, I can just sit there and look at her laying a little bit, and I love that. And my good friend here, Greg Burns, when I go down to his place and he puts me to work, he reminds me every time why I never want to be a commercial beekeeper.
Thank you.
It's it's always, Brian, put that frame, put that box back, get over here, and we got to keep moving on. So
Right. There's a necessary efficiency with it that comes with a higher scale of beekeeping.
exactly, yeah. But that's kind of me. I mean, I've been this next year. This upcoming season. I was thinking the other day, this will be my 7th season. So I've gone through the initial. I hit my peak and where I thought I knew everything and anything that was out there, and I lost all my colonies. And now I'm in that recovering phase where, I've ironed out kind of like my strategy in that. And I'm still 11 for 11 through this winter. I live in Northeast Ohio. So, we get some of that like lake effect off of Lake Erie. We get that type of weather and things like that. So, but still 11 for 11. I'm crossing my fingers that they all make it through. But that's a little bit of my story. So, Greg Burns.
Well, Dr. Peck, we're excited to have you on. I had the honor of sitting down with you and Corey and Nathan Coleman. They're at the Hive Life conference at the podcast booth, and that was a great conversation. So I'm looking forward to learning more about what you're doing and how it applies to not only the educational side, but putting those things into practice at all scales and what that means kind of for all of us. Just a little bit about us. My wife and I, we raise 7 kids on the farm, Nature's Image Farm in Zanesville, Ohio. And our focus is raising nukes and queens. And by all comparison, we're a very small operation. This coming season, we'll probably raise between 300 and 600 kind of colonies for the most part, and we'll sell a couple hundred nukes and raise between 1,000 and 2,000 queens. And that's kind of where our scale and context is kind of at the moment. But it's a family affair. We all pitch in, we all work together. So that's kind of what our focus is on. And so, of course, breeding queens and constantly tuning them up and doing better and seeing those progressions from mother to daughter and on and on and on year after year is obviously very important for all of us and making great queens. So it's going to be a fun talk, I think, to dig in a little bit deeper into what you're doing and how that applies to all of us, no matter the scale and no matter who is breeding the queens. It all affects everything as one whole.
Right.
So that's kind of a little bit about what we do. Of course, meeting you at Hive Life A lot of folks were introduced to our podcast and YouTube channel at Nature's Image Farm, where we just share kind of our experience, what we're doing. And then recently it's more focused on the Hive Live interview series, where all the folks that came through us and sat down will get to kind of share their story and things like that. So that's kind of what we are in a nutshell. And then our friend Bruce Jenny down here. Bruce, tell us all a little bit more about you and what you do down in Dothan, Alabama.
Well, I'm down here in the great state of Alabama, southeastern corner, a place called Dothan. And Dr. Peck, last year you spoke at Hive Life, and that was the first time I had a chance to listen to you talk about your work. And it was just, it kind of amazed me. And so you probably don't remember because you've talked to thousands of people since then, but I came back and you were gracious enough to talk to me for about 15, 20 minutes or so back at your booth about some mites. I just ran some things by you and you gave me your opinion, and it was much appreciated. But I live here, like I say, in Southeast Alabama. I think I'm firm in the Sideliner camp. I vacillate between 100 to 150 colonies. I usually build up to about 150, and now I'm back to about 100, 110. I usually have a fair amount of loss. I'm trying to get better at that. This year was better than last year, which is good. But I kind of enjoy, I still can't figure out what I want to be when I grow up. So I've got some Apiary hives here in my backyard. I've got quite a few palletized hives that are actually on a truck. They're probably arriving in California, Williams, California, probably about an hour, within the next hour or two. I've got 52 colonies on that semi truck going out there for almonds. And then I've got another, 30 or 40 or maybe 50, something like that, out production colonies still that kind of stay behind, or they're in my production yards. And so I kind of I dabble in all of it.
You're playing the field.
I have a lot of really good, I've had a couple of, 2 or 3 really good mentors locally here, along with these guys and the guys, many of the folks that are in the comment section here that have kind of helped guide me along the way, including yourself with the information you gave me. And so I'm still, I'm 10 years in, I'm still trying to learn. And I really, my goals would be to go full-time commercial, but I just can't seem to pull the trigger to get, let go of that full-time job. That's a pretty good paying job. And so I've had a lot of issues with down here in the South with, I've tried to become more, I like to use the term intentional beekeeping is a word I like to use. I've tried to use that word kind of along with Kamen's philosophy of the great queen's dead mites and proper nutrition. I've kind of tried to implement that more this year with better success, but I still have a long ways to go. So I really look forward to this conversation tonight. I think there's going to be a lot of great information passed. As far as family goes, I've got 4 kids. The youngest is a freshman in college at Auburn University. My other 3 all live out in Utah, and a couple of grandkids out there too. So a couple of them are married I've got a couple of grandkids. And so that's kind of my family situation. My wife is really good to help as needed with everything except getting in the bees, but she'll help with all the other stuff. She'll extract honey. She'll deliver honey. She'll, do kind of the financial stuff, whatever. And she will, if I really asked her to, she would help with that. But she is a tremendous support to me in so many ways. And I really appreciate all the help that she gives me kind of behind the scenes. She don't like to be out in the front of everything, but she is behind the scenes, just kind of helping keep the whole ship going, so to speak.
Excellent.
So that's my story.
Well, I've likewise got a wife at home behind the scenes. So we've got an almost 6-month-old who this is going to run right through her bedtime. And so my wife very generously allowed me to come back to the office and hang out with you folks instead of helping with that process, or instead of trying to do this, down and have her hollering, that I have to stop laughing and talking and carrying on because the baby's asleep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you've each described yourselves as a hobbyist, a commercial, and a sideliner beekeeper. And it's something that I think folks sometimes struggle with is they look at these definitions for what it is to be a hobbyist or a commercial or a sideliner, and it's always based on the number of hives. And that's not really what it is at all. It's, do you have a day job that isn't beekeeping? It's, do you take the time to sit and stare at that queen laying eggs for 5 minutes or not? And based on your answers to that, it determines which of those you are. You can be a big commercial guy or a small commercial guy, but if bees are your livelihood and everything else is a side hustle, you're a commercial beekeeper. If you're making some money off the bees, you're mindful of the fact that there's a way to make money off of bees, but you're still taking the time to, you might have a day job and you're also, maybe taking some more time to stare at the bees and give yourself that moment, because you don't have 600 colonies to go look at. You've only got 100. I think that's what makes you a sideliner. And Brian, I think, whether you get 50 hives or not, as long as you've got the spare time to do it, if you're looking at a hive and you can say, I wonder what they're up to, I'd like to just watch, maybe I'll let them go even though I know it's going to cut into my honey production this year for that hive. That's, I think, the mindset of a hobbyist. And they're all valuable mindsets. I think each of us needs to sort of dabble at least in the thinking patterns of those other types of beekeeping.
Yeah.
So I guess in some ways I'm the fourth kind. I'm a research beekeeper. So I've got I have had 40 or 50 hives probably at the most that I was taking care of solo, just myself, during graduate school. Currently,
Wow.
I've got one hive at home that I'm overwintering. So it varies quite a lot. But because I'm here at Betterbee as the director of research and education, in some ways, all of the the hundreds of hives that we've got, the overwintered nukes that we're breeding and selling, and the production hives that we maintain, those are all in some way sort of my colonies too. So I
Mhm.
dabble in the care and maintenance of all of those. But the way that I beekeep, it tends more towards the hobbyist in some ways, in that I'm willing to sit at a hive and just sort of stare at them and observe them and examine them. But
Mhm.
a lot of my graduate work involved me sitting and maybe having to stare at one brood frame for hours at a time, because I had to go pluck out all of the mites and the pupae and try to count how many there were and how many of the mites were reproductive. So I wind up looking far more closely than many beekeepers at some things. Certainly, sticky boards with live mites on the bottoms, trying to count how many of their legs have been bitten off, is something I've spent more time doing than most beekeepers have. But I've only extracted honey a handful of times because as a scientist, especially in graduate school, honey was sort of an annoying waste byproduct that just got in our way. It just made my job heavier when I had to go in and do an experiment. And so the way that I think about beekeeping, even though I'm not a full-time researcher anymore, still has that mindset of the
Mhm.
my goal is to study these bees and to learn from them every time I open a colony. And if I manage to make a successful nuke, or if I manage to produce more honey, that's just sort of a bonus at this stage.
Mhm. Yeah, and I found myself, so when this was, we set this up and got the date confirmed. I found myself, I watched the Hive Life talk that you gave last year, and even though I still remember parts of it, and what was fascinating to me, what I saw last year was the video of when the varroa mite was on the flower,
It
and when it climbed onto that bee and just got itself all tucked away, I just thought, this is just unreal. I just,
It is certainly a crowd pleaser of a video. And we shot that. That was in graduate school. So my doctoral advisor was Tom Seeley, who many people know and appreciate as a bee researcher and educator. He very much has sort of that scientist or that hobbyist mindset. He couldn't care less about what the commercial beekeepers are doing, and that's good. That's why he's able to have the insights he has. And then it turns out commercial beekeepers who read his books still learn a lot that is relevant to what they're doing. But when I was talking to Tom, he is such a believer in the honeybees. He's such a believer in the cooperation of the honeybees and what that can teach us about human cooperation. And I get that. I appreciate that. But at the same time, my training is really as a parasite behaviorist. For years I would tell people I'm not really a beekeeper. I'm a varroa mite keeper. And the best way to keep varroa mites is just keep bees really poorly, and the varroa mites will take care of themselves. But one of the things that I sort of instilled in Tom, I suggested that we go do that study to figure out whether a varroa mite on a flower could jump onto a foraging bee. And that wasn't my idea. That was something that Jeff Pettis at the USDA had published. He said that they'd found mites when they were inspecting flowers. They said if this flower had gone to an open air flower market somewhere, and if a honeybee had gone and foraged on it, like, could that mite have spread? Could that mite have spread with
mhm.
viruses from a totally different continent? And the answer was, we don't know. We have no idea whether the mites are capable of it. So the thing I said to Tom before we went off and did that test, he said, I don't think it's worth the time. I don't think we should, gather the bees up and take the week to go off and do the research project. And I said, Tom, never underestimate a parasite, because a parasite does exactly what it has to do to survive, just like any animal does. And we know that honeybees put in so much work They are so sophisticated. They are so good at sort of walking that knife's edge of surviving in what sometimes is a very hostile climate and getting done what they need to get done. The same thing is true of a varroa mite or a tick or anything like that. Just because they make their living in a way that we might consider dishonest doesn't mean that they aren't sophisticated, doesn't mean that they aren't very good at what they have to be very good at. And so I said to him, I bet if you put a varroa mite on a flower and the only way that mite's going to survive is if it can get onto a honeybee and a honeybee should happen to land there for a couple of seconds, I bet that mite will be all over her. And I bet she's going to make some very clever moves about where to put herself so the bee can't knock her off. And that's exactly what we saw. So that's what that video shows. It's not that I think that all of our mites are spreading at all of the flowers around our hives. I've showed that video, and sometimes people will say, well, to keep my bees healthy, should I go mow down all of the flowers around my hive so that there's no place for the mites to spread? And I say, no, that's not that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point is, we can't look at these mites and think, here's a dumb, gross, disgusting little bug, and as soon as we get the right chemical, we can just kill it and be done with it. We've got to respect them as, an animal in their own right, as an enemy that is pretty darn capable. So we've got to respect that enemy enough to really put in the effort to learn about them and to fight them effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Peck, a lot of us, there's so much information out there, and there's so many great collaborations. You mentioned Seeley and yourself, and a lot of folks, no matter the scale, they're trying to better understand what that information has to do with them in their context, but more importantly, how does that apply to the big picture of beekeeping. And I was hoping tonight we can get into some of those kind of nuance. I don't want to say get lost in the weeds type things, but try to break down some of the core components of the work that you've been doing over the last several years, and maybe break those down into some digestible chunks so folks can better understand the work that you're doing and also how it applies to scale aside, how it actually applies to bees and what we can do to keep our bees as healthy as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to dive into any topic that we want to. I think one thing a distinction that I'll make, I respect Tom tremendously, but he and I have had some disagreements because he has been advocating for what he calls sort of variously Darwinian beekeeping or natural beekeeping. This idea that if we give the bees some of the tools that they have in nature, they might not need as much intervention from beekeepers. And I think that there's a place for that. I think there's a certain kind of beekeeper who's okay having two hives that are, a half kilometer apart from one another, not making very much honey from them, allowing that colony to swarm or those colonies to swarm every year. And I think that can contribute to a kind of sustainable beekeeping, but it does not answer the questions that really any of the three of you have about the kinds of beekeeping you're doing. And so I've tried to advocate for him to talk about that nuance a little more and to say that he's advocating something very different from even sort of what most hobbyists are trying to pursue. So my feeling is that there's certainly a time and a place for that beekeeping philosophy, but we do need to make sure that what we're learning about how bees live in nature doesn't sort of suck us into this notion that everything we do is wrong and we should just mimic nature whenever possible. So we can learn lessons from those natural colonies, but the lessons have to be learned and then taken and applied. The mindset of, well, we found that these bees that are able to survive out in the forest, they are not forest in south of Ithaca, those bees are able to survive, but part of that seems to be that they swarm every year. And that swarming involves sort of separating the mite population, introducing a brood break, doing all of the things that we know can affect varroa reproduction. So that's an important lesson for us to learn. But I think Tom's takeaway is maybe we should let all of our colonies swarm every year. And my takeaway is, even if I had a mite-resistant bee, like these mite-resistant bees in the forest, mite resistance alone isn't enough. They're not mite-proof. And so part of what's helping those bees is swarming. If I keep my bees from swarming, that probably is something I'm going to have to trade for a miticide treatment at least once or twice during the year, because I'm not giving them that whole suite of natural behaviors. I'm only taking advantage of parts of it. So I've got to supplement the rest in order to get to that sustainable level where I don't have disease-based losses.
That's a great point. And I know I've had Corey Stevens on and talked at length. Of course, you know Corey well. Most of the audience knows Corey too. Corey has been very transparent in the fact that for every pro or step forward, there may be some other baggage that comes along with that we try to sort through and kind of understand. With respect to the work of Tom Seeley, it very likely could just be me and my mindset. When I've tried to sort through that information pertaining to the bees in the forest, I can't help but constantly get stuck on the fact that it presents the relationship with bees and nature very idealistically in a situation where the bees are existing in a very, very, very low density, low stocking rate,
Right.
and very low stocking density, which doesn't apply to any single beekeeper if you have 2 hives on a stand in your backyard.
Right.
You're already outside of that context and parameters. So it's difficult to understand how a lot of that information actually translates to the reality. I was hoping tonight you could speak to, with respect to everyone's work, there are some distinctions between the idealistic approach and the reality of actually beekeeping, and where a lot of your studies are coming in to maybe bridge some of this or shed light into some of these different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, Tom doesn't care about the commercial side of beekeeping, and that's fine, right? That he doesn't need to think about that. He's just thinking about the bees as animals. He is a natural historian, and I once asked him, I said, Tom, if you couldn't have studied honeybees, what would you have studied? And he said, man-o'-war jellyfish. Immediately, he said it. And I said, why? And he said, well, because they're a bunch of organisms that are really cooperating to form one big superorganism. That's what he finds interesting. He is an animal behaviorist through and through, and the fact that the animal he studies is relevant to, agriculture is sort of a side note to him. So when you're using a mindset that uses terminology like stocking density, right? That's already you're talking like a farmer there, and that's fine. More power to you. You should be, because you are. But that's not the philosophy he's using to study the bees. So what you have to take away from his natural history work, I think, is the lessons of the bees in the forest tell us important things about what the bees would be doing if we weren't involved. We are involved. So obviously we can't just mimic that. Instead, we need to figure out what is applicable and what isn't applicable. What advantages do bees have out in the forest? And so somebody on here has very generously highlighted one of the papers that Tom and I published, which was a paper called, I don't remember the full title, but essentially the title was Mite Bombs or Robber Lures. And the idea behind that study was people have been talking about varroa mite bombs for a long time. And I objected to that because the idea of the mite bomb, to me, if you think about a bomb, what is it? It's one thing here, and it blows up, and it shoots its shrapnel out. So all of the fault of that is being blamed on the bees in that sick colony. And we did an experiment, and I said, well, yeah, what that is essentially is drift. If I'm seeing a bomb blow up and a bunch of shrapnel leave, what I'm talking about is a bunch of bees drifting out of the sick colony and going into all of the healthy colonies nearby. So that's one possible way that varroa mites can spread from one of those mite bombs. But the other side of it, which we named robber lure, and I'll tell you, it took us an entire weekend. We'd just be sitting there shouting names back and forth to each other. Does this make sense, or does that conjure the right image? So we settled on robber lure because what that suggests is that we've got this sick colony. It's not that colony got sick that caused the problem in all the hives next door. It's that colony got sick with varroa mites, and then all of the other colonies came knocking on their door to steal their honey. And so in that study, we set out this array of colonies at different distances from one another, and we monitored when there were bees that had drifted from the sick colony into the healthy ones, and we monitored when there were robbers from the healthy colonies showing up at the sick one. And we monitored the varroa levels in each of those colonies. And what we found, what our data suggested, was that, in the fall in upstate New York, and it might work differently where you are, it seems like robbing is a much more significant factor in the spread of those mites than drifting is. That drifting is part of it, drifting is happening, but drifting is something that happens within an apiary. So when we had colonies that were, full of varroa mites and had no varroa mites, and they were 1 meter apart from each other, yeah, There were bees that were drifting back and forth, and that was definitely leading to an increase in the mites within that little baby apiary. But we had colonies 50 meters away and 300 meters away to the east and the west. And those colonies that were 300 meters away, their mite population didn't change. They hardly ever had any of the sick bees drifting into them. And so clearly that was not, even that small amount of distance that's getting a little bit closer to how bees live in nature, that had a protective effect on the spread and the mixing and the matching of those varroa mites. But as soon as the sick colonies collapsed, as soon as they got so sick that they could get overwhelmed by robbers, they got obliterated. And I actually used a method from, I think, the 1500s for monitoring robbing bees. So that was a fun little historical thing to go into. So in the 1500s, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Nickel Jacob Wright, went out and he was studying bees, and he took flour and he powdered some of the bees, and then he went and looked at which hives they were going into. So we did the same thing. I did it with powdered sugar, but I took a tube and I filled it up with powdered sugar, and I went to the entrance of a colony that was getting robbed, and I puffed sugar over everybody. And then I sprinted to all of those other colonies 50 meters away and 300 meters away,
Wow.
and I waited to see sugared bees coming in. Every single one of them had sugar-covered bees coming in. So that robbing was ubiquitous. And we know that was happening at 300 meters, but we know that bees will rob, miles away from their colony if that's the only game in town. Their job is to find sugar. If the only sugar is in a weak, sick colony nearby, then they're going to get it. So the lesson there was, if we talk about varroa mite spread and varroa mite control and varroa mite management, if our bees are living in a high density apiary, we need to worry about drift and we need to worry about robbing. If our bees are not in that high density, if you're the kind of beekeeper who does have, 11 colonies, but you own 30 acres, and, you can figure out your electric fencing strategy so that you can just run them along a fence line instead of having to have them all tied up together in the same apiary, that might reduce the drift. You might have less opportunity for mite drift throughout part of the season, but if one of the colonies does get really sick, you're still going to have a robbing problem. So it gives you insights into when you should be monitoring, what kind of monitoring you should be doing. It doesn't, neither of those strategies solves varroa mites. And that's I think one of the big takeaways is the more we learn, the more informed our management strategies can be, but we still got to manage. We've got to manage the bees and we've got to manage the mites, because neither will solve themselves on their own.
That's interesting, because I can think of two different conversations. I know we've spoken to Ian Stepler several times, and Ian, he keeps, where his out yards and that are, he keeps that area pretty much, that is Stepler Farms, to eliminate the potential risk of having that mite bomb. And there was another gentleman, and I forget who it was I was talking to, that he would treat his hives, and he had used Apivar at first, and his mite counts actually went up. And he had contacted the company, and they were looking at lot numbers and everything just to see, well, maybe it was an issue here on our end. And then here, come to find out, when it all came full circle, he had found out that there was a close apiary to his that was treatment free.
Yep.
And it was basically just, there were those failing colonies, and it was just bombing his apiary.
Just manufacturing mites. Yep, absolutely. And I think that's very common, that folks will do their very best, and sometimes they find themselves getting overwhelmed by mites and they don't know why. And the answer is that someone else isn't doing their very best. But it is important, we've been talking about that philosophy of how bees live in nature, and should we just sort of mimic that and not go any further? Well, if we let our bees swarm every year, what's Ian going to have surrounding all of his Stepler apiaries? He's going to have a bunch of feral Stepler swarm colonies living in the trees, and they're going to be, growing mites and then probably dying from them, at least some of them, and then contaminating the rest of the operation. So, as any good livestock manager knows, you're not going to have a lot of success controlling disease if you've got your managed animals and then animals, feral wild animals of the exact same species on the other side of the fence, going out and getting sick and then, spreading disease back into your managed population. So it's important to understand what happens in nature. That doesn't mean that we should just do everything to mimic it right away.
I had a quick question. When it comes to an apiary, for example, what I found is I've gone through and sometimes I'll have, 40, 48 colonies in one spot, or I may have 5 or 10 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
More of my pollination type stuff, I try to keep them on pallets with more of a dense number of colonies in one spot. But what I notice when I do my mite washes, which I've just started doing more intentionally this year, is that I may have, let's just say 80, 85, even 90% of the colonies that are well within threshold on the mite counts. But I'll have, just say we have 50 colonies, just say we have 20 colonies. I may have, 15 or 16 that are well within threshold. Many of those may have 0 mites to 1 mite in the wash, but I may have 2 that have 10, 12, 9, 15. So
Right.
what is your explanation for that? I've heard that as I talked to other beekeepers. I think I've mentioned to Greg and Brian and other folks here on the chat. Do you have a theory as to why that is? Why certain colonies tend to have, and many times it's the stronger colonies, they seem perfectly healthy, but they seem to have a higher mite load.
So it could be, there's a few things, right? It could be genetic. Could be that those colonies just aren't as hygienic, don't groom as well, that there's something in their genetic makeup that just makes them less resistant to the mites. But you're right that it tends to be the stronger colonies. So there's 2 explanations for that, and they can both explain where your mites came from. Why would a colony be stronger than another? Why would a colony have more bees than another? Well, answer number 1 is that colony had more brood, that they have produced more bees, and the more brood a colony has, and the longer they've got brood, the more opportunities the mites have to go in and have another generation of reproduction. So if this colony was big and strong and was able to start brooding 2 weeks before all the rest of them, and they've got twice as much brood throughout the season, that's a chance for more and more mite reproduction to take place. The other thing, though, is that we do know in an apiary that there are patterns of where and how and when bees drift. And so if you've got a colony that's absolutely just, slammed with bees, they've got more foragers than they know what to do with, it's entirely possible that a large number of those foragers were not born inside that hive. And you can go in and find some of this research, and it's been research that's been done since the 60s, right? Jay in the 60s, and I'm blanking on the other authors, but there's a few other authors who have done studies where they basically just go in, they figure out, all right, here's all the bees living in this hive. Let's figure out which colony they came from. Let's do a bunch of genetic tests and figure out, were they born here or were they born somewhere else? They sometimes find that more than half of the bees in the colony weren't born in that colony, that they drifted in, or they went out on their first orientation flight and they didn't orient very well, and they just stumbled back into the colony next door, or the beekeepers moving frames and brood around trying to keep our colonies balanced, but it does wind up changing a little bit of that mix. So there's also a possibility that, if you've got 2 big strong colonies, maybe they're on the ends of the row, it's possible that they're picking up a lot of the drifters, right? The drifter has in their head, all right, I live in, we've got 10 colonies. I live in colony number 7. And so the really well-organized focused bees, they're going to fly out and they'll fly back in and they'll go into colony 7. But some of the bees that are a little bit ditzier, maybe they're ditzy because they've got viruses, maybe they're ditzy because they've got a mite on them and they're, scratching at it. Those are the bees that might fly out, come back and say, which one do I live in? It's not the middle, it's sort of off to the right. And so they'll kind of drift off to the right, and they get to the end of the row and they go, whoop, that was too far. And then they'll just go back to the next closest colony. So we do know that very often in rows of colonies like that, the colonies on the ends will wind up strongest. And a lot of that is just transplants of bees just flying out and then going into those end colonies. And so that could potentially be transmitting mites into those colonies as well. Although my best guess is that it's more explained by mite reproduction inside those colonies, and it's just some colony level difference that we can't see until we notice that the mite population's higher.
Yeah, it also seems sometimes like even consistent hives that are consistent, and it just seems like it's totally random. Sometimes it is the end colonies, sometimes it's just a completely random colony that is an equal strength with the 5 colonies right next to it, and that one has a wash of 10 or 12.
Yep.
And all 4 of the ones on the same pallet are at 0, 1, or 2 or whatever. So it's kind of bizarre.
And part of that too is, we like to imagine that the alcohol wash is sort of the end all be all of mite monitoring, because in some ways it's a lot more accurate than something like a screen bottom board and a sticky board. But the reality is, all we're measuring is the phoretic mites, the dispersing mites that are on the bees at that point. So, if you've got a colony that swarmed on you or went queenless or superseded or did something funny, and so they've had a brood break, suddenly there's no brood in that colony for a while, you're going to have a whole lot more mites in your alcohol wash, but it doesn't mean that there's more mites in the colony. It just means that more of them were detectable when you washed those bees. So it is important when you're doing the alcohol washes that you don't have to go frame by frame, but you've certainly got to look at that brood nest critically and say, is there any reason for me to think that something funny might have happened here? Because some of those peculiarities can influence the mites that you'll get on the alcohol wash that week.
We've kind of opened up a couple balls of worms that I don't think we can probably put back. At least I'm stuck on them. And you're the guy to speak to about it. Anyone who lives on a farm or works with cows, how viruses and bacteria are transmitted and grow and reproduce. Unfortunately, we're sometimes too intimately aware of that, and it's hard to compare what we know with the things that seem way outside of our sphere of understanding. When it comes to cows, for instance, it doesn't matter if we're on 500 acres or 5 acres. If we have a herd just over the fence, let's say with pink eye, and we have flies that are going over and they can transmit the pink eye right back to our cows just like that, it's easy for us to understand how that gets transmitted. If we have something like hairy wart that's in our soil and the cows get into it, it's a systemic, it's kind of always going to be there. Kind of a situation. That's a different way that we kind of look at some of those things. You have sicknesses and things that come on, like worms or pneumonia, and there's a whole list of things that we do about that. But when it comes to the mites, we get into this very mysterious land of how exactly are they making the bee sick? How exactly? You mentioned that you really don't believe that it's a mite bomb that's exploding and creating shrapnel out from the center outward, but a lot of us see, like what you guys just mentioned, where there are areas where there are colonies that are overrun with mites, and we should maybe at some point clarify that they're overran with viral loads that are making them sick. That when bees are robbing out those colonies, something is going on to where those bees are getting sick, and so we either believe we're bringing hitchhikers home, or they're exposed to that virus while they're in the colony and they bring that home. So the one point maybe I'd ask you to touch on is how exactly, if we don't want to call it a mite bomb because of what a bomb is, if we could maybe talk about how it is exactly that these bees, are they bringing hitchhikers home? Are they bringing the virus home? Number one. And the second thing that I think you could possibly tie in here is, I don't know I've heard anyone talk about it, but I keep seeing this. I talked to Bob Benny about it too. But there is always the situations when we are monitoring for mites. For us, we use dish soap instead of alcohol, but you make a good point about the brood saturation. How much brood is there in a colony? And that does matter. But what some of us are finding here in the field, especially in the last maybe 2 years, is we can have colonies that can have absolutely outlandish mite washes and are perfectly healthy and clean and beautiful and are top producing hives. We can have other hives, for instance, that are washing zeros and ones, and they are upside down on their ear, deformed wing virus, and lots of other things going on too. I think there's something going on that we were focusing on trying to, yes, eliminate mites, but in my opinion, I feel like this is such a very, very narrow part of the puzzle. The bees are being exposed to the viruses, and just like we're seeing in our own, and I hate to anthropomorphize, but we're seeing viruses mutate and adapt with us. It's almost as though none of this is equal. You can have a colony that's washing zeros and ones, that there may be a virus occurring in that colony that isn't occurring in a highly saturated mite load in another colony. To clarify the question there, it seems as though those things are not equal. There is issues with that, where the virus is being transmitted no matter the mite count, that dictates the overall response of the colony. And then how does that, what is the mechanism that the bees are either bringing home hitchhikers or they're bringing back viruses to make that colony sick?
So I'll give you unsatisfying answers to both questions. So the question of the mechanism is, not a lot of people have studied it. I'm one of them, and I still don't have an answer. And I don't know of anyone who has a better answer than me. So it seems at this point like drift and robbing of bees is happening in both of these cases. It seems like when drift and robbing of bees happens, the mite population itself increases. And so I can say with some confidence that part of the story is the spread of the mites themselves and the viruses that they're carrying. However, we know that some of these bee viruses, not all of them, but some of them can be spread just by contact between individuals. And there's an awful lot of contact when a guard bee and a robber bee are tangling with each other on the front porch of a hive. And so I have every reason to believe that a sick hive, a colony where the viruses have gotten increasingly out of control, and that's probably why they're so susceptible to robbers. I think that those hives are also directly spreading some of those viruses, the ones that are most easily transmissible. You can even have these sort of confusing robbing frenzies where the resident bee inside a colony that's getting robbed gets so overwhelmed and says, well, my colony's falling apart. I don't even know if the queen's still alive, but here's a bee and she's doing stuff. Maybe I'll just go with her. So I think we could even have sick bees following the robbers home and trying to move in with them. So, things can get very chaotic during that robbing period, especially if it's in an apiary setting. And I've seen that myself, where, I had 3 colonies with high mites waiting for them to get robbed. And I had 2 colonies with low mites to either side. They were all in a line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, when the first colony started getting robbed, there were bees of all different colors from all different colonies in all of them. So there was a huge increase in drift, I think, as a result of the robbing. The things just got so overwhelmed that a bee would go, I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I'm just going to go in here because it looks like there isn't a war going on. So there's a lot of opportunities for spread, and I think it's probably a combination of both the viruses and the mites. The other question, though, the question is, how can we have high mites in one colony and low mites in another colony and still have evidence that viruses are causing harm there? Part of the answer is you don't need a varroa mite to spread a virus. There are some bee viruses, things like chronic bee paralysis virus, that can be transmitted by the mites, but that's not the primary or even necessarily the most important mechanism for their increase in the hive. And so you might have a viral disease that has nothing to do with your mite situation. More often than not, though, what you'll wind up with is a mite-associated increase in viruses. But if you don't have the really bad virus or the strain of the really bad virus in your varroa mites, and if nobody else, in the area, if you don't have any swarm hives, you don't have any beekeeping neighbors who also have that bad virus, then you're probably not going to see a lot of harm coming to the bees. I will tell you, it is difficult to do doctoral research on parasites. It is a heck of a lot more difficult to do it on viruses. I did some virology collaborations. I worked with some folks in the UK who were studying things like the different substrains of deformed wing virus, because we know that there's deformed wing virus A, deformed wing virus B, deformed wing virus C. Some of them cause wing deformities and kill the bees dead. Some of them don't seem to cause that much harm. Some of them reduce the chances of the colony surviving the winter. It hurts their lifespan, but it doesn't cause their wing deformities earlier in the year, no matter how high the mites get. So there's different kinds of deformed wing virus, and that's just one of the 10 bee viruses that we've named. And those are just 10 of the bee viruses that virologists have actually been able to go out and sequence and study. So it is hard, because I don't have an antiviral drug that I can sell to a beekeeper, to get people to focus too much on the viruses. It's easier to focus on the mites because we do know that uncontrolled mites is the best predictor of you having a virus problem. But it's not a guarantee, because if the virus isn't there, then the mites don't do any harm. If I had 100, black-legged ticks feeding on me right now, I'd be itchy and uncomfortable and unhappy about it. But if none of them was carrying Lyme disease, I could just carry on with my day as soon as all the ticks detach. The problem is the bacteria that they transmit. But the best way to avoid getting Lyme disease is avoiding getting those ticks. Because, I can't look at a tick and figure out whether or not it's infected. So, it is an unsatisfying answer to say managing the mites is the best that we can do, even though we know that that's not the whole story, because managing the viruses is so difficult. But, why would you have a colony that has high mites and doesn't have a virus problem? Maybe they don't have the virus that makes them sick, maybe they've got genes that are just making them resistant to that virus. Maybe the deformed wing virus is there, but those bees have an immune response that's keeping it from causing any kind of problem for them. And there are people doing that research, and we don't have satisfying answers yet to say,
Right.
aha, this is what it is.
That's a great answer, and I appreciate the transparency with that, because there's a lot of folks who are just gleaning on what the most accurate information, the most it is we always feel like, I mean no disrespect by it, but we always feel like the goalpost is constantly being moved all the time, and there's no way to really get on board with what program, what to do. There's a lot of focus on the hygienic behavior of bees to obviously eliminate not only the mites, but to eliminate sick pupae from the colony. And of course, that helps. But to me, and it might just be my simple-mindedness, but to me, I'm going to the source, which is the virus. And so while we are spending so much time trying to eliminate the mite out of the picture, which obviously is important, it seems as though the viruses that turn our colonies on their ear are those rogue viruses that we don't understand, that may only be in those colonies that are washing zeros and ones, and they get turned upside down. Your analogy with the ticks, is spot on. If we go out there and have 30 black ticks and none of them are carrying it, it's no big deal. But if we just walk even under a neatly manicured system and everything's beautiful and it's in balance, and we are exposed to just one Lone Star tick, okay, game over. Right. That's the analogy that I keep seeing, and a lot of folks are starting to see, is we just have that one Lone Star tick that is showing up versus 200 black ticks, and of that percent, some of them might be carrying. It's so incredibly frustrating, especially when beekeeping is your way to make a living, to try to constantly find what is going to work. And so I do appreciate, although it's unsatisfying, there is, believe it or not, some comfort in knowing that, hey, we haven't figured this out yet. We're trying to figure it out. But I think it opens up the dialogue a little bit too for all sides of this conversation, whether it's treatment free or whether it's nuke them and let God sort them out. There is the area, but it is not black and white. We're living in all these different shades of gray when it comes to that. So I appreciate your answer to that.
And the importance, I think there are some scientists who feel like it's their job to be confident and to tell you the answer. And I think that's dangerous. In the same way that talking to a first or a second year beekeeper who thinks they've got all the answers is dangerous. You don't want your mentor to be someone who's only had bees for 2 years, right? You want somebody who's had bees for 10 years, and at year 2 and at year 7, all their bees died because they did something wrong. But they've been learning through that process. They've been learning how to do better, right? That's the ideal person to learn from, because it forces you to have that mindset of humility, to say, I think I know what I think I know. I don't even know if I know what I know, and I definitely know that I don't know anything that I don't know. Right?
That's great. Yeah.
So, I think that the mindset of some of the honeybee extension researchers, or the folks you talk to, and I know them, I like them a lot, can sometimes be a little bit too authoritative when beekeepers want to talk about the nuance, when they want to explain the weird fluke and not just the most common explanation. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is these mites have only been on these bees for maybe a century, less than that. They've only been in North America since 1987. So we have not had a lot of time to solve these problems as beekeepers, as honeybee agriculturalists. We also haven't had a lot of time as honeybee scientists to study these mites and study these viruses and figure out the answers here. And it doesn't help that, as you say, they're always adapting and changing too. So even if we figure out what was happening in 1987, might not be the same story as what's happening right now. So the thing to keep in mind is science. You talk about moving goalposts, and there's an important criticism of people who come out too confidently there. But at the same time, if science ever had all the answers, it would stop, right? The point of science is that we're always going to have more to learn. We're always going to be able to improve our knowledge. And so the fact that scientists are coming out and saying, hey, we actually did another study, and it turns out we might have misinterpreted something last year, and what we're telling you now might be more accurate. That's how it's always going to happen. That's the point of it, is that we always refine our knowledge. But a critical problem is that there tend not to be enough conversations between folks like you who are actually having these problems and the scientists who are doing this work. A lot of the time, the scientists doing the work are the graduate students of the professors, and the professors aren't just handing the students projects left, right, and center. They're saying, come in, find an interesting question, design an experiment, make your hypotheses, test it out, try to come up with an answer. That's a good way to teach someone how to do science, but it means that if those grad students aren't going and talking to Greg Burns and saying, Greg, what problems are you having? What questions do you have? You wind up with people doing experiments that are good experiments, but they aren't answering the questions that people really want answered. And so I think one of the things I take seriously in my role here at Betterbee is, I'm allowed to do whatever research I want. I could do research on figuring out whether or not varroa mites have a favorite color, but I'm not going to do that until I've solved all of the really big problems that people bring to me. It's more important for me to test whether or not, peppermint candies are going to keep small hive beetles away than it is for me to ask sort of abstract questions about whether or not varroa mites, have best friends. So it's a process, and it's a process that always improves with communication. I think if we communicate clearly what our questions are, what we're seeing, what we want, and if we can convince the scientists to communicate frankly and say, this is stuff we do know, this is stuff we don't really know, it's a lot easier for us to find those gaps in our knowledge and then do some work to expand the knowledge.
Dr. Peck, I've got a couple of my local colleagues or friends. One of them is an Alabama bee inspector, is on here right now. He's watching, as well as one of my partners, I guess you would say, for the pollination thing that we're doing. Actually, Tyler Walker's on here, and Tyler had a comment I think that is applicable here. He's a young guy. He's split up. I think he's got around 1,000+ colonies, and he works full time. So he's a machine. But he says this. He says, the more I keep bees, the less I care about varroa, and the more I care about production. The viruses are real and can be detrimental, but I like what Greg touched on when he talked about some hives being absolute mite bombs and are healthy in every way and productive. From a breeding perspective, are we getting it wrong to snub our nose at a phenomenal production hive that's a mite bomb for a productive, quote unquote, productive hive with lower mite loads? Maybe there's something to be desired from survivor stock.
Yep. So my question there, or one important question to be answered, is before I start making a breeding program around the colony that produces a ton of honey but also a ton of mites, is does that colony survive the winter? So I've had plenty of colonies that have had lots and lots and lots of mites in them, and they've also made lots and lots and lots of honey for me, and they've been dead by the time we got to November in upstate New York. Now, that is an important distinction. You are not in upstate New York. So I think folks in the South tend to have an easier time because you have an easier winter. So that easier winter period, when you've got, if you've got high mites, it might be something you can kind of eke your bees through, get them through to the spring, and they might be able to get right back to growing and producing honey for you.
I will say that it's just different. I think my typical loss, and I think a lot of folks down here in the South would agree with this, I believe, is my worst time of the year is late July, August, September. Yep. So, and then of course in the spring, if it warms up and they starve, starve from it getting warm, and the bees grow with the whatever starts to bloom, and then we have a dearth, it can be detrimental. But my biggest issue, I think, is because right here we have the tallow crop. It's a very heavy, it's like you turn on a fire hose. It's just crazy. It goes from a water hose from a house, just a water hose to a fire hose overnight for about 2-3, maybe at most a month at the most, and then it turns off again. So we pull our honey. I usually pull my second, the latest honey in early to mid-July. And then for about 6 weeks, there's nothing. Well, the problem is there's so much honey in there. It's so hot. The population has grown. And then all of a sudden we pull the honey and there's nothing coming in. There's still honey down in the brood. I'll leave plenty of food on there for the bees, but that's when we have my hives crash. It's hive beetles. It's mites. I don't know what it is, but that's where I just get in trouble. I think we may have discussed this. You probably don't remember when I was up there last year, but it's just, it's kind of hard to know what to do in that situation. A lot of commercial people down here really are geared towards the pollination services. So they just grow their bees. They're not really focused on honey. Right. I'm kind of doing a little bit of all of it. And I do have those production colonies. I really kind of enjoy doing the honey aspect of it, but man, those bees just take a beating when I pull the honey, and when it's like, there's a perfect storm right there in late July, August, early September, before the goldenrod blooms. there's just a lot
Yep.
going on there.
Yep.
So that's what I run into every year. That's where most of my loss is. And I didn't know if you could speak to, and I know we may be going here later, a little bit later in the chat, but maybe a treating strategy. I'm sure we're going to discuss that a little bit. I didn't know, Greg, if you wanted to go a different direction, or Brian, but that's kind of where this year I tried, some Apivar / Amatraz type products. And then I tried some Apigard, and then I've been hitting with the OA here in the wintertime some. And I've been trying to murder mites, but I haven't really thought about the fact that, hey, maybe it's okay if they have a few mites, if it's a strong colony. I haven't thought about that really. I mean, Tyler just kind of introduced that. I just hadn't thought about that. So,
yeah, I mean, we know that a colony can survive, for a year with some varroa mites. We know that a colony can survive for a year with some viruses. We know that they can survive for a year with, maybe a crummy bloom or some crummy nutrition. So they can get through a lot of those things if that's the only thing they're dealing with. But if you've got a neighbor spraying pesticides, if you've got high mites, the mites are transmitting bad viruses, the bees have a nutrition problem, if all of that's hitting them at once, you're much more likely to see trouble. I do think that there is a little bit of a problem here where a lot of the varroa research was taking place in Germany, then it was taking place in the United Kingdom, then it was taking place in the US, and it was mostly taking place in northern states. And so as a beekeeper in a northern state, I have one challenge that my bees have to deal with, right? And that's winter, because that's always going to be the hardest time. If they've got a mite problem, if they've got a pesticide problem, if they've got a nutrition problem, that's all well and good, but it's going to kill them in the winter. It's not going to kill them in June. So I need to control it during the season to get ready for the challenge period for my bees. That's not quite the same story that you guys have. You guys are constantly cycling through. Now we've got higher hive beetles. Now the mites are getting higher. Now it's too hot for the bees to be able to function very well. Now we've got to take the tallow off. Now, my neighbor's spraying his pesticide. So it's a different calendar. And unfortunately, not enough research has been done in southern states, in warmer climates, on exactly, the best management strategies there. So, I speak very much from the perspective of my own beekeeping and my own research, which has taken place in upstate New York. So I can confidently tell you that if I have high mites going into the fall, I'm unlikely to have that colony survive until spring, because winter might be 5 months long. But that's not the situation that you guys are facing. So you might be able to get away with a different management paradigm, a different management strategy. High mites are still going to make a colony sicker than no mites. So no mites is better, but they might not have you might not have the same prioritizations that I've got. And the answer for that is, right to the Auburn Bee Lab, right to the Beltsville Bee, or the Gainesville Bee Lab, and say, hey guys, I've got these questions and I need you guys to do it, because the folks up in New York are answering their questions. But I need you guys to focus on some of this. You've got great labs down there. But,
sure. And I've got Philip on here. He's the Alabama Bee Inspector, and he is in communication constantly, I think, with the Auburn Bee Lab. Yep. It's just a couple hours north of us here. And I know Georgia does some research. I know Florida does as well, but I appreciate you answering that question for me.
Yep.
Interesting question here from Clark's Bees and Such, John. If I recall correctly, varroa don't move by sight, they move by smell. Are there any smells that would repel them, that wouldn't harm the bees, oregano or something else?
So importantly, and this is one of my little, this is me preaching about how you have to respect varroa as an animal first if you're really going to fight it. It's not just that they don't navigate by sight, it's that varroa mites don't have eyes. They're completely blind. Because why would you have eyes if you lived in a dark honeybee colony and you never meant to ever leave it under any circumstances? It'd be stupid to waste time having eyes. So they don't. So no, they're completely blind, and they navigate using the chemical sensing hairs on that sort of first pair of legs that they've got. They're arachnids, not insects, so they don't have antennae, but they use that front pair of legs and the hairs on them sort of like a pair of antennae. So yes, the varroa mites are navigating by smell, and there has been some work on breeding bees that had different odors, so that they might have different attractiveness. The pupae might have different attractiveness to the prepupae might have different attractiveness to the mites. I don't know that that's gone anywhere terribly fruitful. There have also been folks who have been trying to develop, and this is something I've advised people on, and I'll advise you guys. If anybody comes up with this, Betterbee would be happy to carry it, right? If you can come up with a cell, and you can put a smell into that cell that smells just like a drone pupa or a drone larva that's just getting ready to get capped, and you can get all of the varroa mites to run into that cell because they can smell it, and then zap them with electricity or something, I encourage you to do so. Because if we could do that, if we could use those smells to lure them in, we know that there's stuff that they're looking for. So we might be able to confuse them, to trick them, to manipulate them that way. Nobody's given me a prototype to test yet, but I'm happy to as soon as somebody hands it to me. In terms of repelling them, in terms of getting rid of them, I don't know of anyone who's come up with anything yet, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something, right? How many chemicals have we tested in beehives? Not all of the chemicals there are. So it's entirely possible that somebody will find that allspice is really, really repulsive to varroa mites and the bees don't care about it. But at this point, I don't know of anyone who's done that work.
Dr. Peck, peppermint is definitely seems to be the craze in the last year. Have you had any studies or repeat studies that either support or question?
I have done 0 studies myself. I have read 0 studies. I have talked to 0 scientists who have done any studies. So it is, as you say, it's a craze, but until the science gets done, we don't really know whether it works, how it works, what the best way to do it is. I just had a call today from somebody at Hive Life said, hey, you really got to test peppermint. And I said, okay, I'll try to fit it into my research schedule. I might go out if I get a colony that has high hive beetles up here, I might see what I can figure out. Do at least a couple of little pilot projects. Somebody called me today though, and he said, hey, just so you know, I took some peppermints and I took some hive beetles and I put them together in a Rubbermaid tub and I looked at them and they totally ignored them. They didn't go to the other side of the tub. They didn't try to get away from them. The hive beetles couldn't have cared less. So, right there, right away, I can tell you that based on one person's study who they reported to me, it sounds like it's not working the way some people suggest. It's not that the smell of peppermint is so repulsive to hive beetles that it makes them rip their own antennae out and lose their minds. Because they were walking around and stepping on the candies and walking past and going back and forth. So that's not the answer. The suggestion that this fella had, this fella Robin, which is perfectly reasonable, and I might very well be able to test, or someone else could, is maybe it's not that the peppermint is repulsive to the hive beetles. Maybe instead it's that it masks the smell of the honeybee colony. So we know that we've got problem number 1, which is the small hive beetles reproducing inside your given hive that you're looking at. But problem number 2 is all of the small hive beetles reproducing in your region of the county who can smell those honeybee colonies from miles away and then zoom into them, fly in, invade, and start reproducing. So a question that I still haven't had answered to me satisfactorily is when you guys, and I assume, Bruce, you've got a bigger problem with small hive beetles than I do. Typically, the further south you go, the worse they get. Up here, if I have small hive beetles, I go, oh, that's annoying. What a shame. And I've got to make sure I extract my honey within a couple of days of pulling it off the bees. But other than that, they're not causing a problem for me most of the time. I assume that's not what Bruce is dealing with. So I assume you have to do some real careful thinking about hive beetles throughout parts of your season. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'll just kind of give you, and this is not any type of scientific research, but I tried some peppermint this year, and overall my hive beetles were better this year. Last year, I got absolutely hammered down with hive beetles, lost a lot of colonies. I think many times that the issue with hive beetles is more, I do believe, and I've experienced where some of the stronger colonies get taken out by hive beetles. But I do think that there's initially an underlying cause that weakens the colony. Even if there are a lot of bees, maybe there's some viruses, some mites. I think it's a relationship. I think hive beetles are somewhat opportunistic. However, I've heard with the hive beetles that with the peppermint, I don't know if it's so much that they're repelled by the peppermint as much as the bees eat the peppermint. They really like the peppermint. And so I've heard, I don't know what the theory behind it is, that possibly there's an exchange with the food exchange where the hive beetles something about that. I'm not sure exactly how it's supposed to work. I do know this year I did not use it consistently per quote unquote protocol. but I did throw some peppermints in there as I was going through. I can't go through, when you got 150 colonies, you just can't go through every box and put 4 peppermints in every corner,
Right.
or crush up peppermints in every
3
box
days.
every
Right.
week or whatever. But
Right.
but I did have fewer hive beetles. Some years are worse than others.
Yep.
I did not have the loss this year to hive beetles that I typically do, but I'm not going to attribute it necessarily to that. I don't think it hurt. Maybe it helped some, but this year I did a better job with mite control. I did a better job with overall management. I think my space was better overall. It wasn't perfect, far from it.
Yep.
And it wasn't, I think last year was just very wet, and it was just a really bad year here for hive beetles. I think overall this year wasn't as bad, but man, there is nothing. It is one of the nastiest things it's just really gross. Probably my least favorite thing in beekeeping is opening up a dead out that's full of the hive beetle maggots everywhere, and it's just
I mean,
gross.
I say I don't have a problem with them. I've had slime supers before. I've pulled out brood combs from colonies that died and had nothing but maggots crawling out. So I know how bad it can get.
It's
but
gross.
it's ugly. So the point there though is we don't know for sure, when you're fighting those beetles, how many of those beetles were born in that hive and how many were born somewhere else. And so if the peppermint isn't so much something that repels the beetle, but it's something that makes it harder for new ones to find that hive odor, maybe if the bigger problem is immigration of the beetles than anything else, maybe that's how it's having a positive effect. I don't know. But you made a really important point, and it relates a little bit to what Greg was asking about earlier, this idea that you can have a colony that's strong, a colony that's making honey, and a colony that has a very high mite level, and we say, well, everything's fine. I know the mites are high, but everything otherwise is doing really well, so why should I worry about this? And so I will just say, the reason I only have one hive at my house right now is that I moved here from graduate school. I took this job at Betterbee, so I moved to Eastern New York, and I got all excited. My wife and I bought a 13-acre farm. I'm getting in the fruit trees. I'm planting the grapevines this spring. I'm excited to really get into it and expand the homestead. And a big part of that dream has always been to have my own bees. But the problem is, every time I come up with an experiment or an idea and I say, hey, you know what would be great? What if we bred as many varroa mites as we could in one colony? And we showed that colony can be really strong in June, and really strong in July, and really strong in August, and really strong in early September. And then over the course of just a couple of weeks, it can completely fall apart. To show people what that looks like, to really convince them that, hey, my colony was strong and I don't think I had a mite problem, so it must have been something else that killed them, isn't really correct, because it does wind up being the mites and the viruses that will tip them over the edge. And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you do it at your house? So
right, exactly.
I bred varroa mites at home in these two colonies, and one of them, the mite population got high enough that we watched exactly that. It was a huge colony. They were in 4 deeps. They were doing magnificently. They made a ton of honey, and they were riddled with varroa mites. And just over the course of a couple of weeks, we watched them die. So on the Betterbee YouTube channel, and I recommend that you check this out. I recommend that you show it to other people when they say, I've got mites, but I don't think it's a problem, and that can't have been what killed my bees. I want you to look at it, because the change in those brood frames when we pull them out, between everything looks 100% great, the brood pattern is good, I see no reason for alarm, except when we do the alcohol wash and we find 60 or 70 or 80 mites per 100 for 300 bees. There's no other sign of concern. 3 weeks later, we go in and we've got bald brood, we've got half-chewed brood, things are absolutely falling apart. So it can happen quickly, and it's the fault of the mites and the viruses, but it's not that every additional mite you get makes your bees sicker and sicker and sicker. They can be healthy, dead. So I think that's also part of what's happening with hive beetles. When folks say hive beetles got their colony, if they're not staying on top of their varroa mites, I've always got to suspect that what happened was varroa and viruses killed their colony, and the hive beetles just took over. When the bees were already weakened. I think that's a more common story than folks would like to admit, because nobody wants to admit that they didn't stay on top of their varroa management, or they didn't bother to monitor quite as much as they said they would, and so they aren't really sure what their mite levels were the week before the colony died.
Yeah, if anyone wants to see what it looks like, exactly what you described, you can just watch a video from mine from last summer where I just had I think the title is something like, if you don't take care of your bees or pay the prices, I think the title or something like that, where I went out there, they just crashed right about the time I harvested honey. I think also Matt Kirkland on here talked about, Matt talked about, I guess they live south of Houston, And the biggest issues they have is if they don't pull the honey soon enough, which is true, because what happens is, as when you got the tallow coming in, the bees are built up, they're strong, and then there's like a shift that takes place. When that tallow shuts off around here, it's like there's nothing. I mean, very, very minimal stuff trickling in, maybe a little pollen, a little bit of stuff, but not enough to sustain a big, strong colony. So the population starts to drop, and while that population drops, the mites and beetles, I guess, number of mites per bees or whatever goes up, and the beetles go up. And so then what happens is they can't cover the space, they can't cover the honey, they can't cover everything. And then it can crash very quickly. As soon as those hive beetle, the bees can't corral or keep them in check, and they can start laying eggs, they can just destroy that and slam that honey, that hive. And sometimes I don't even know if it's a super weak colony that dies from that. It's just all the honey dripping on them, they abscond. Rarely do you find a bunch of dead bees. It's usually an abscond situation.
Right, you just go into an empty hive, but for the hive beetles and the slime. Yeah,
man, I learned that the hard way. Like my third year of beekeeping, I had 3 colonies. I was just going to leave the honey on and let them get through winter, thinking, man, that's a great strategy. And I ordered some queens from up north. I was going to make splits out of these super booming, strong colonies. And within a couple of days, I had them prepped, had them picked out how I was going to do it. Went down a couple of days later with my new queens, mated queens I had gotten from up north. And there was 3 colonies there. There was a great big huge swarm up in the tree. I guess all those colonies had merged up there. They'd absconded, and there was slime everywhere. But I was thinking, if I leave more honey, that's better. But down here, and I think probably everywhere, you have to manage that honey stores. You can't have too much, especially with the hive beetle situation. And if they can't defend all that honey and those hive beetle larvae get in there, it's game over. Even if they're not dead, they're somewhere else. They're not in that colony anymore, that hive. So anyway,
I've been lucky, at least in my area. Now I'll have a few, and I'll be shocked. Like, I'll open up a colony. I had one where I would count 15 or 20. And, then I watch some of the videos down south, and they're like, I wish I only had 15 or 20. If you think that's bad, come down here, because I'll open it up and there's, literally, I mean, just dozens, hundreds, So I'm kind of lucky, but Northeast Ohio, we have, the colder weather. So, I haven't quite had to deal with the small hive beetle issues, thankfully.
It can get bad. It can definitely get bad up north. And I think, Dr. Peck, you keep, I don't know if we should call you the Band-Aid ripper-offer or the scab peeler, but you keep, there's little topics that keep coming up here. But I don't know that the dichotomy is maybe the right way to approach that. But when we were just talking about the potential, what is the actual threat of the varroa mite? It's not the mite itself. It's the viral load that they carry.
Right.
You mentioned the mechanism of, we don't really know. It's yes and no. It depends. It's some of the hitchhikers coming back. It's the viral transmission via saliva or just being in contact. So that's one set of issues. But when we talk about, the pests and pest management and the small hive beetles, those rascals are something completely different altogether. We certainly, and I with respect to everyone's experience, all of our experiences are valid, and we're going to see different things. But we have absolutely 100% seen very weak colonies in a pine thicket that do beautifully. And I have seen doubles and triples, extremely strong colonies absolutely get overrun with small hive beetles. The issue is, and the difference is, if we're only talking about viral transmission, okay, the mites seem to dominate that conversation. It does seem as though small hive beetles do have the opportunity to transmit viruses in different ways, but they're sliming out colonies. The issue with the hive beetles is that they're using all of those goodies on the bottom board and everywhere else in the frames to multiply and replicate, and that becomes the nuisance. So yes, we were talking to Humberto, I think it was about a year ago, and they were just on the very edge of trying to quantify. They've qualified that yes, there does seem to be A bacteria and also B viruses that are being transmitted from small hive beetle, and that'll scare the socks off you. But the fact that the hive beetle it's a twofold situation makes it even more challenging to try to combat. Have you been in touch? Do you have any up-to-date research or information regarding viral or bacterial transmission from small hive beetles to the bees?
So I've seen some of the work essentially demonstrating that if you take a small hive beetle and you look for bee viruses on it, you can find it. And I don't know that anyone has done work to really say, here's a colony that has virus A and a colony that doesn't have it, and then we let some beetles spread, and then it got in there. The problem too is, unless you can completely eliminate varroa from the picture and completely eliminate bee drift from the picture, even if you did that experiment, you couldn't guarantee that it was the beetles that did it. But we know that the beetles have some of those detectable infectious particles on them. I guess a thing to keep in mind, and this it sometimes blows people's mind when they learn it, is we look at these viruses, things like deformed wing virus. We know that deformed wing virus is harmful for bees. We know that high levels of deformed wing virus can kill a honeybee colony. We know that varroa mites spread deformed wing virus within a colony and can spread it between colonies. But what people don't always necessarily know, or don't remember that they once learned, is that deformed wing virus isn't a varroa mite virus. Deformed wing virus is a bee virus. Deformed wing virus has been in honeybees since long before the varroa mites ever showed up. So when the deformed wing virus is in a colony and the only way for it to spread is bees, trophallaxis, tongue-to-tongue exchanging food with one another, sure, every once in a while a new bee is going to pick up the virus and so it'll circulate in the colony, but at low levels, and it's not going to get into everybody. So in the same way, we know that those beetles can spread those bacteria, they can spread those viruses from colony A to colony B, or at least we imagine that they can because we can find it on the beetle. But then the question is, just because the virus or the bacteria showed up, is it going to make all or some of those bees sick? And so that's, again, where you sort of get that 1-2 punch, right? I've got bees, I've got high viruses, or I've got high mites, and maybe really low viruses. So everything's hunky-dory until the hive beetle next door flies in and brings in that tiny little shred of virus. Well, now all of those mites are going to be transmitting, and start to make the bees sick. So it remains sort of an interaction between the bees, the mites, the beetles, any of these organisms that are at play. Ultimately, what's going to cause the harm, for the most part, is the bacteria, or more importantly, in this case, the viruses. But I don't have an antiviral that I can sell you. I don't have a good virus test. Even when I work with virology labs and I take bees and I put them on dry ice and I send them off and they grind them up and they test them, they sometimes write back and say, sorry, it just didn't quite work and we weren't able to sequence the viruses in that sample. So it's very, very difficult for us to get a handle on it. It is easier, and this is that's the academic answer. The academic answer is the virus is what's killing your bees. The practical commercial beekeeper answer that I have to give you right now is, I can't solve your virus problem, but if you solve your varroa mite and maybe also your hive beetle problems, that's going to hugely reduce the risk from those viruses that I can't solve for you yet. So, like I said, the science isn't done. It'll never be done, but we're continually making progress. We just had this company, Dalen, that released this American foul brood vaccine, or announced the preliminary approvals for them to do testing for the American foul brood vaccine. They feed it to a queen. The queen produces, lays her eggs. All of the offspring that grow up have these traces of the American foul brood proteins, which are then going to sort of prime their bodies to fight American foul brood bacteria if they encounter it. Well, that's cool, but how big a problem is American foul brood for any of our hives? It's a problem if it shows up, but it mostly doesn't show up. It's pretty well under control, and you burn colonies when it does show up, and you can eliminate it. So that's not maybe the pathogen that I would have started with, but it's the one that they did. But now that they've done that, the question is, okay, can they do that same thing or find a way to do something similar with deformed wing virus? Can they find a way to help make a queen so that she lays eggs and every single offspring, single worker that she produces is now resistant or immune to deformed wing virus? That is a heck of a bee. Again, we're not there, but they know that. They're aware that their next step, their future step, is looking at EFB, looking at deformed wing virus, looking at bee paralysis viruses. Because if they can find ways to even boost the resistance to those, it helps us tolerate a slightly higher mite level. Infinite mites, gonna cause a problem. Tiny little mite population, you could still have your bees die. But The lower the mites, the lower the viruses, the lower the bacteria, the lower the pesticide exposure, all of that will contribute to a healthier colony overall. So each of those needs to be our management goals.
It's a great question from Stan Gore at Texas Friendly Beekeepers. Can you ask David, how do some genetics tolerate varroa, not resistant, but actually tolerate the viruses? Is there a super immunity development? Amazing stuff. Is there a certain genetic that seems to have a higher resistance to viral loads?
Yeah, so this is something that we talked a little bit when we had Corey at the Hive Life booth. But there's this distinction that needs to be drawn between it's annoyingly complex, between resistance and tolerance, right? So if I've got a bee, I'm holding it right here, or I've got a colony of bees, I'll hold them all in a clump, right? They can be resistant to varroa mites. That means if I put 100 varroa mites on them, they're going to kill them or prevent them from reproducing, and you'll wind up with fewer varroa mites over time. Or they can be tolerant to the varroa mites, which means that I put 100 mites on, there might be 100, there might be 101, there might be 110 varroa mites the next time I check them, but the bees aren't going to have health problems. They're going to be fine. So that's the difference between resisting the parasite, you actively kill it and fight it, or tolerating it. You're just able to survive even though it's there. The same thing is true for the viruses. You can have a colony that's resistant to viruses. They're actually killing the virus when it gets into their body, or they're melanizing it, or they're encapsulating, damaged cells so that the virus can't reproduce. Or you can have a bee that's their body is swimming with deformed wing virus and it just isn't causing disease. Her wings are fine, her behavior is fine, her organs are fine, her lifespan isn't affected. So that's a tolerant bee as opposed to the resistant bee that can defeat the virus. We don't have a perfect picture of every bee in the country or in the world for all of those questions. We know that there are bees that are resistant to mites, right? That's your hygienic bees, that's your grooming bees, that's any of these resistance traits we talk about. The bees that people suggest are tolerant to mites are probably just bees that are able to deal with the viruses that those mites carry, or they're in a population where there are no viruses, so the mites aren't causing any problem. It's like me with 100 ticks. I might be itchy, but I'm not going to get Lyme disease. So then we get into the virus resistance and tolerance. The insect immune system is complicated, and it's complicated in a very different way from how ours is complicated. They don't have the same mechanisms. They don't have antibodies that go in and mark pathogens that they've seen before. So it's a very different kind of response. So to be resistant or tolerant to a virus is something that we have less understanding of because of the differences of the insect immune system. But there are cases where you've got bees that have higher levels of virus and show lower levels of disease. So we don't know how they're doing it, but we do know that has been observed before. That you can go out and you can find a case where you've got higher deformed wing virus that would normally be causing disease, but it's not causing it in that bee population. I don't know of anyone who is using those sorts of tests to make queen selections. And part of the reason is, as I said, it's hard to do the virology. You've got to go in and actually quantify the viruses per bee in that colony before I can say, hey, this is a really promising one. I better take my queen lines from there. So you've really got to be working directly with a virology lab, somebody with a great big qPCR machine and a bunch of minus 80-degree freezers, in order for you to even evaluate your 100 breeder colonies and figure out which one you're going to pull your resistant tolerant line from. So again, that's part of why a lot of the breeding programs have focused on things like hygienic behavior, because the hygienic behavior test does not require a laboratory. That being said, a hygienic bee is not varroa proof. So clearly that's not the end all be all solution to our problems. It's just one thing that we're able to select for that does seem to at least contribute to the bee's health.
We would be remiss not to ask you a nearly knee-jerk reactionary question, but it is in the forefront of a lot of conversations right now. We were talking about queen and queen selection and virology. A lot of us have, I think, some pretty obvious responses to this new vaccine. How at all does this fit into any of this? Is this more of a cool, this is something, but can we do something with that later? Once this queen has this vaccine and she supersedes or she swarms Now what?
Right.
If we want to pretend that we're all for sustainable beekeeping physically, we don't. Being financially sustainable is a dirty word for many folks, unfortunately. But how does this vaccine play into any of this right now, or does it?
So, well, I'll tell you this. So I'm at Betterbee, right? I'm the director of research and education, but I'm not the only scientist here. One of the owners of Betterbee is a veterinarian named Chris Cripps, and he is a scientist. He's a veterinarian. He is a beekeeper, and he understands the bee industry. So he was actually called by the folks who developed that virus at one point when they were doing some of their market research. And they said to him, hey, how much would you pay for a queen who was, resistant or immune to American foul brood? Would you pay $50 more? Would you pay $100 more? Would you pay $150 more? And he was like, no, maybe a quarter. Maybe beekeepers would pay a quarter more for that queen. It'd be nice. And if this can be done cheaply, if it can be produced in a nice, affordable way, maybe there's no reason for every queen breeder not to buy their vaccine, buy the candy that needs to be fed to those queens, get the queens exposed to it. Sure, like it'd be better if our bees were more resistant to AFB, but AFB isn't a crisis for us. And so I'm not going to pay $50 so that I can have an AFB-proof bee. I'm just going to keep keeping bees. And, in all of my years of keeping bees, I found AFB once. We quarantined the yard. It didn't spread. So it was just the one time. It was sad. I poured gasoline in. We burned the colony. We buried the ashes. And then that was the end of it. So, you can overcome that without this vaccine. I think it's promising. I think it's exciting because there are people who are trying totally new strategies to improve bee health. And I think that there's potential in it. I hope that they can sustain themselves with whatever price point they set so that they can continue to fund, as I said, the research on things like EFB, which is a bigger problem, especially if folks are going to blueberry pollination. It seems like you go to blueberries and for whatever reason, you tend to have EFB outbreaks soon afterwards. So if you can find a way to, produce EFB resistance, that might be more exciting. Virus resistance is the game changer, I think. If I can laugh at the face of the varroa mite because my bees can survive any number of viruses, then suddenly things are going to get a lot easier for me. But you're exactly right. That queen supersedes or that queen gets replaced. I either need to be able to call this company up and pay a little bit of money to get my own, candy plug that I can pop in a queen cage to get my new queen exposed to it, or it's hard to argue that it's going to totally change the game for my beekeeping. It's a cool technology. It's an exciting group of research, and I'm excited that it's coming out. But I'm not going to break open my piggy bank so that I can spend every penny I've got to put that in my brand new queens for next year.
It's great that something's up in the forefront like that, but in the case of going back to farming, a lot of folks who are beekeepers are intimately aware of raising chickens or rabbits or pigs. Yet is there, and maybe in some parts of the country, there is still medicated feed out there to feed our animals. Is that the best choice for them? Do we actually need it in that format? The answer for most folks is absolutely not. Right. However, if there was something in there that did actually address a valid concern, that's a different story. So I think a lot of us are excited that no matter if it's the lady beekeeper from Texas getting on the Joe Rogan show and raising awareness of beekeeping to the entire country and a broad audience, or if it's this vaccine that may have very little to no effect at all on bees, the fact that it's getting some attention. Right. Maybe there will be future funding and such that will actually move this in a way more positive direction. Right. And we can start to address things like the viral loads and the strains that are affecting the bees. But it's interesting. There are a lot of these things are nowhere to be. There's no conversations anywhere being had about, or maybe there is, but something like this pops up and it gets everyone's attention. It would be extremely beneficial if something like viral control or virus mitigating strategies was as much of a buzzword as something like an American foul brood vaccine.
And part of that too is just sort of the pipeline that goes into somebody developing a new honeybee medicine, right? It costs so darn much to do this work that you can't expect a private company, a startup company, to go in and say that they're going to tackle something that scientists struggle with. So the answer to it is you need to make sure that your scientists who are, taking tax dollars and spending it to do research are answering the questions that you want answered. And it's not the fault of the scientists doing that if the beekeepers aren't sort of standing up with one voice and saying, these are our top 10 questions.
Sure.
So there's a major problem. This is something I've talked about with Cayman. It's something I've talked about with folks at AFB, AHPA, all of the bee organizations. If we don't get ourselves organized enough that we can say, these are the top 5 priorities for commercial guys, these are the top 5 priorities for sideliners, these are the top 5 priorities for hobbyists, these are the top 5 priorities for northern states, these are the top 5 priorities for southern states. If we can't make those lists and have somebody, hand that to every bee lab in the country and have them go, geez, that's weird. Well, they all agree that viruses are a priority, so let's allocate half of our funding to that. And then it turns out, these folks have those questions and those folks have those, so why doesn't your lab tackle this and our lab will tackle that? We've got to articulate what our questions are and what our pain points are. And a major problem, this is something that was a major part of my talk at Hive Life earlier this month, is beekeepers have this attitude of, I'm going to use whatever illegal miticide I can get my hands on, and I'm going to sort of wink and tell my friends, hey, don't tell the government, but I'm breaking the law and doing this. When we do stuff like that, it makes us sort of have to be secretive by necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're being secretive like that, it means that the scientists don't even have any idea what we're up to. So they don't, we can't go to them and say, hey, I think that the illegal Bovatraz that I'm putting on my commercial hives and the almonds, or the illegal antibiotics that I'm putting on my colonies to suppress the growth of bacterial disease, I think they're having a different effect than they used to 5 years ago. That's the kind of thing that a scientist could jump on. They could get a grant, they could study it, they could get all kinds of good answers. But if we're doing stuff in the shadows and we aren't even talking about it, now suddenly the scientists don't know what our questions are. So they're free to design whatever, study that they want to do, and it may or may not be relevant.
That's a good point. Yep.
I have a question here, and it's somewhat, it fell right into place, and it's from other than everybody knows the famous Mike Berry. So let me pull up. I need to come on, let's get that up there. Here we go. Share that. So the question here that Mike has is, there was talk a couple years back about honeybee RNAi research and some ideas towards being able to actually increase the interrupters as a better viral defense. That conversation seems to have died down in the last couple of years. Is that something that you, Dr. Peck, are familiar with? If so, is it even something that's practical? Last paper that he saw was from Allison McAfee, but he said he could be wrong. Seems if we could give the honeybee more time to stave off the viruses before they succumb, it would give treatments and beekeepers more time.
Yep. So I'm not an expert on the RNAi work. I've read some of it. I'm familiar with a little bit of it, and it is also my impression that it is not moving forward quickly or very effectively. It's a mechanism of delivering a medication to a bee, right? If I've got a bee in a cage and I can feed her RNAi that I've synthesized that's going to interfere with the RNA virus's ability to reproduce, that's a pretty decent way to sort of shoot that virus right in the face when it gets into the bee's body. The problem is, how do I get that RNAi and how do I get it into every single bee? So it's one of those things that's an interesting insect immunity. It's an interesting sort of RNA virology scientific question. I don't know if it ever had much potential for a practical day-to-day beekeeping, solution. Maybe it could. And again, I'm not an expert on RNAi, so maybe there are folks who have found ways to stabilize and mass produce it in a way that would have been effective, but for something that they just haven't quite solved. But my understanding at this point is that is not going to be tomorrow's solution. But the point that's sort of made there is a really good one. It's if the RNAi is partially effective, it can help fight the varroa mites, or it can help fight the viruses, give the bees a little more time, or give the beekeeper a little more time. Isn't that useful? And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about things like the extended release oxalic acid treatments, which there have been plenty of folks. Jennifer Berry has done research. Auburn has done research. I was just talking to Cameron Jack today about some of the research that he and Jamie Ellis and Umberto have done. They are finding that it is not an effective miticide if you've got high mites to put on one of these extended release pads and have it knock your mite population down. However, they are also finding, just like folks are finding in different parts of the country, if you put it onto one of these colonies that has low mites, it helps to keep the mites low for longer. So it means that instead of having to go in every month and do an amitraz treatment, or every 2 months and do a formic acid, whatever is working for you and your bees in your area, instead of having to do that, maybe I can eliminate 1, 2, 3 of those treatments throughout the year, and I'll just go in and I'll hit them hard with something, maybe when the weather's a little bit nicer, or when I'm not trying to make honey. So those are the sorts of tools that are really valuable to us, even if it doesn't solve the varroa problem. Even if that new drug doesn't 100% solve the mites or doesn't 100% solve the viruses, if it gives us yet another advantage, and it is yet another way to knock the mites down 5%, those are the sorts of things that we can stack together. And if I get 20 things that knock the mites down 5%, suddenly we've totally won that fight, right?
Right.
So I think that's an important mindset. Not a great answer on the RNAi stuff, but that idea that just because something isn't 100% effective doesn't mean it isn't worth pursuing, because even if it's partially effective, it can have real value to bees and beekeepers.
Right, right. And just kind of following along this conversation here, I mean, this just fell right into place, just talking about the treatments and that.
Yep.
But here, and this is from Jason, a good friend, is there really a measurable risk by leaving Apivar strips in beyond the recommended time frame? And then do we see an unintended, uncontrolled benefit? And I can kind of think, before we get into the answer, I can kind of think also Greg has, Greg, you had a perfect example last year, though. I think it was last year with Apigard, and we could talk about that in a second. But Jason's question here about the Apivar.
Yeah, we know that Apivar, that amitraz, is not 100% non-toxic to bees or humans, right? I wouldn't want to eat a whole Apivar strip, and the manufacturers wouldn't tell me that I should. And I wouldn't want to make a little vest out of an Apivar strip and make a queen wear it all day, every day for her entire 3-year lifespan. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some negative effects of that. So in more exposure than necessary to any synthetic pesticide is always a bad idea. The bigger risk, though, the far, far more serious concern, is that long-term exposure of sublethal doses of a synthetic pesticide is exactly where you get resistant varroa mites. So if I have an Apivar strip or any Apivar, any amitraz application, and I put that into my colony, and then I leave it there too long, or the level isn't high enough, what I've done is I've created an environment where now my mites are walking around, and the ones that are really, really susceptible to Apivar, to amitraz, they're still going to get killed. But the ones who are a little bit less susceptible, maybe they're going to be able to survive. And then as the concentration of the pesticide goes down over time, maybe those ones that were able to survive will start reproducing, and maybe the population climbs. And I put another Apivar strip in, and suddenly I've got some more resistant mites in that population. We know that's almost exactly what happened with Apistan. Apistan is talfluvalinate, and talfluvalinate builds up in the wax. And so what that meant was that even though we were taking the Apistan strips out, hopefully, we still had a chronic low level of the Apistan chemical, which meant that the varroa mites best able to resist that were the ones that were able to reproduce. And so those were the ones that started to predominate, and we wound up with totally Apistan-resistant mites. Coumaphos is the exact same story. It's a synthetic pesticide. It built up in the wax. The mites were exposed to low levels of it for a long period of time, and the few mites that were able to survive and thrive were the ones that came to dominate. So the risk of not following the label for Apivar is exactly the same. There's some evidence that the specific mechanisms of resistance are going to be a little bit different. So I am less worried about Apivar becoming useless to the same extent that Apistan is pretty much useless at this stage. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a risk, and that doesn't mean that there isn't evidence of Apistan-resistant mites. Frank Rinkovich at the USDA is doing great work showing that he can find Apistan-resistant mites, amitraz-resistant, Apivar-resistant mites, and that they persist. They remain apivar resistant if all you do is keep trying to treat them with more apivar. He's also found that if you treat those colonies for a year or so with vaporized oxalic acid, and then you go back in and treat them, suddenly the bees aren't apistan or amitraz resistant anymore, right? The different miticide removes the incentive or the advantage to the mites that are resistant to the synthetic. And so when you hit them with the synthetic again, suddenly they're all susceptible again. So, it continues to support that idea. You can't just say, this is the strongest miticide, so I'm going to use it and nothing else. You've got to have that mindset of, which is the right miticide now? Which one did I use last? I've got to make sure I'm cycling. I've got to keep the mites on their toes, so I'm not giving them a strong evolutionary incentive to evolve complete resistance to the amitraz, and then no resistance to formic or oxalic because I'm not using that. I want to be cycling that in part because it's going to throw off the mite's opportunities to evolve resistance.
Interesting.
Awesome. I wondered if we could maybe this is just, we could go all night with this. Good grief, but we've got folks on here probably from all over the world. I know we got people from all over the country for sure, and maybe different countries, but I think for folks that are just kind of in the hives, like everyone on here pretty much is, most of us are, if you could kind of give us some guidelines for treatments, how to treat, what would you recommend? Obviously it's different in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, but what would be some guidelines for us to help us kind of know, first of all, what are some strategies we could use and how to implement them in our own apiaries?
So the first and most important piece of advice that I'll give you is, if you only listen to one thing I say, ignore everything that I'm going to say after this. Your job is to be an expert on exactly what each miticide can do and when it is most appropriate to use on your bees. That's the first step. The first step is not to say, oh yeah, Apistan or Apivar or Apilifevar, I don't remember the difference, but I use the one. Which one has Thymol? I think I used that last year. You can't have that mindset. You've got to be 100% on top of exactly what this miticide is and that miticide is and what the temperature limits are for this, and can I use that one with honey supers on? Because if you have a good understanding of all of the tools, it's going to be a lot easier for you to pick out the correct tool for you to use in any given month. The second piece of advice I'll give you is the ideal form of varroa mite control has 3 steps in any control activity that you do. So number 1, you are going to monitor your mite level and figure out how many mites you have in every colony. And Greg's going to make a face to me when I suggest that he do that, but the ideal is that you figure out exactly how many mites you have in every colony. And if you can't do that, there are mechanisms you can use to try to get an estimate. Number 2, you treat for those varroa mites using whatever miticide you choose. And then number 3, you do another mite wash and you figure out whether or not it did its job. Because you can't treat your pesticide, you can't use your pesticide and then just assume that it did the job. You've got to confirm that it worked, because we know that sometimes it doesn't. So those are the 3 steps of it. And you have to have that mindset no matter which step you're doing, which time of year you're doing it. That being said, there are patterns of miticide use that seem to work well for people. In places like upstate New York, what we find are that there are a few recurring themes. Number 1, you want to keep your mites as low as possible throughout the year, but it is critical that you have your mites as low as possible August, September, October, when your bees are getting ready to and then actively making your winter bees, because that's the hardest time for your bees to go through. So that's what you've got to focus on, keeping them at their healthiest. So an intense, aggressive treatment regime to get whatever mites you've got as low as possible in August, whenever possible, is probably the best way to proceed. After you've done that, we know that if you do an oxalic acid dribble or an oxalic acid vaporization or even a hop guard treatment, if the weather is right for it, when you've got little to no brood in your colony, you can take a low mite level and turn it into an almost no mite level. And that's going to be ideal, because the lower the mites are going into the spring buildup, going into your big growth period, the further back the mites are in that exponential growth rate to build their population. So if I kill a varroa mite in January by doing an OA vaporization, that's a varroa mite I don't have to fight, but I also don't have to fight her daughter or her granddaughter or her great-granddaughter or her great-great-granddaughter. So that is an excellent way for me to control mites throughout the year by fighting them aggressively early in the season.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, that transition from, when the first brood are getting produced, my dandelions start to bloom. And no matter where you are, you've got dandelions. And whenever they bloom, that's pretty much when your real spring begins. From that first dandelion bloom until your bees start making the winter bees, that honey production season, your job is to keep the mites as low as you can, as effectively as you can. And I can't tell you exactly how to do that, because if you've got, weather in that period that's going to be 90 degrees most days, I can't tell you to use a formic acid pad. If the weather is going to be 70 to 80 degrees, then you might do just fine with a formic pro treatment, once or twice during that period. But the trick there is that's the point where you've really got to be monitoring your mites and confirming that whatever miticide you use is, first of all, confirm the miticide's needed. Don't waste money and time if the mites are low. And then if the mites are high, confirm that whatever miticide you chose worked. So for somebody like Brian, you've got 11 colonies. You should be checking all 11, doing your treatments, checking all 11 again. Bruce, you might be somewhere in between. Greg, you're surely not going to be doing that. But you can look at an apiary and you can say, all right, I've got, I don't know how many bees you've got in a bee yard. What's your average?
It depends, 24 to 60. Yeah.
All right, so 60 is a big one, but let's say we look at a 24 apiary. That's pretty typical that you've got about 25 hives in an apiary. Folks will go in and they'll say, well, I can't measure all of them. And if that's true, you can at the very least measure 3 of them. And my advice is that you never measure fewer than 3 in any one bee yard. And the reason for that is sort of what we were talking about before, that there can be flukes. There can be weirdos that have higher mites than everybody else in that apiary. And my advice when you're doing that, when you're trying to take that sort of sample of the bee yard to figure out what's going wrong, is not to give in to your stingy beekeeper instinct to only go to the hives that can spare the 300 bees. So when you go out with beekeepers, there's always that instinct to say, all right, I'm only supposed to measure 3, so who are my 3 biggest? I'll just take the 3 biggest, and I'm going to measure them because I know they can spare the bees. The advice I give people is, if you're only going to measure 3, you need to find the biggest, strongest colony in the apiary, because they've been doing the most growing, they might have been doing the most robbing, and so they might have the highest risk of mites for that reason. You want to find the smallest, weakest colony in the apiary, because they might be small and weak because they've got a mite or a mite and virus problem. So you should be sampling them. Even if they can hardly spare the bees, they've got to be the ones you test. And then if you're only going to choose one more, I suggest your sort of middleist colony, your averagest colony, whoever seems right smack dab in the middle. If you take from those 3, I think you'll have a better chance of detecting that someone in the apiary has a varroa problem. And at that point, you've just got to treat the whole apiary, because you're not going to the trouble of testing everybody. But you should still come back after that treatment and test those 3 again. You've got to confirm that what you're doing is actually having the effect you expected. Because I think a lot of beekeepers' problem with mites, one problem is that you ignore mites, and that's always a losing strategy. But the other problem is that people get lazy and they make assumptions about mites. They assume that because they bought the Apivar strips or they bought the Formic Pro strips, they put it into the colonies, that solves their problem. And you just can't be that cocky. You've got to go in and really confirm that you had the effect you thought you did. So, what you choose is, is it going to be Thymol? Are you going to grab Apilife Var patties? Are you going to grab, Apigard? Are you going to get Hopguard? Are you going to get Amitraz, Apivar? Are you going to get Oxalic, Apibioxal? Any of these are good. Formic acid is good. I don't want to get in trouble. I'm trying to make sure I name everybody, that at least the ones that Betterbee sells. Apistan, it can be effective, although you have to rotate it a lot, and the talfluvalinate can leave residues. So whatever miticide you choose can be a good tool in the moment, but it's less about the miticide and more about figuring out when you've got a mite problem that needs attention. And then you just flip through your Betterbee catalog to our varroicide page and say, all right, well, this tells me which temperatures are okay, and this tells me which ones are good if there's brood or if there isn't brood. And then you just pick whichever one makes the most sense for your time of year.
David, there's a quick question. Obviously, guys, we would love to answer everybody's question, but we probably can't do that. But there was a comment, and it kind of goes back to what Matt Kirkland asked this question. Kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It's the exact situation I have. And the question was, do you have it there, Brian? Can you pull it up? Or
Is
And
that
this
it
is
there?
I know it's
Hmm.
difficult to. This is a very difficult. This is exactly what happens to me because when the honey supers are on, it's hot.
Yeah.
So you
Yep.
can't use the things that you can use with the heat.
Yep.
So that's when the mites are at their worst point down here in the South. That what he just summarized it in one question there exactly what I think my
Yeah.
problem is. So what do you recommend? I know that Apigard, I know people say, and some folks down in this area have used it. I tried a little bit this year, a little bit later in the season, but
Yep.
they'll do like a half a dose of Apigard when it's hot.
Yep.
You can't use a full dose to run them out of the hive, but what would be your recommendation in a situation like that? Pull the honey
Yep.
off in July. What do you do?
I know that folks are happy with Apigard, and so they can make use of that. But it's a major problem. It's a major problem that these products are not suitable for you guys to use for big chunks of the year. I will point one thing out, and I've raised this question with the manufacturer, and they didn't answer me, so now I'm going to raise it publicly. Formic Pro is produced by Nod, Nature's Own Design. Great company, great product, works really well. But you can't use it when the temperature gets above 85 degrees because it too much of the formic acid comes out too quickly, and it'll sort of cook your bees right out of the hive.
Oh, well.
Why couldn't they take that Formic Pro and engineer one where the formic acid comes out slower, where it
Delayed.
doesn't work if it's 70
Right.
degrees, but it does work really well if it's 80 to 100?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why that isn't a product. I hope it becomes a product. I know that they've got a staff scientist up there. Maybe she's working on it. I hope she is.
Possibly kind of like the Amitraz Apivar type thing, and that probably is one of the most effective treatments here. I've used that pretty effectively in July, August, but you can't use it with honey, so that's the issue. But if you slap that in there immediately, it seems to do a pretty good job, and that's what I've tried to do the last couple of years.
Apivar is an effective miticide, and it can be a very good tool if you've pulled your supers off. The one thing that I'll emphasize, and I've alluded to this before, it's what my talk was about. One of my talks was about at Hive Life this year. It is illegal for anybody in the south of the United States right now to use an extended release oxalic acid pad, because the only places you can legally use that are Vermont, New York, and Delaware, because they've sort of approved language that allows you to use it in those 3 states. I have every reason to believe that the EPA, within a matter of weeks, might release a letter that basically tells those states that they need to stop. I'm not sure. Maybe they'll say that they have their blessing and they'll encourage every other state to do the same thing. But we do know that there's some developing changes going on there. That is not a great mite killer, but it does seem like a pretty good mite holder downer. And what you guys need when you take your honey off and it is absolutely boiling hot might not be a varroa killer. It might just be a varroa population growth check. So if you could put one of those onto your colony and have no ill effects on the bees, not kill the mites, but also not let them get any higher, and hold them from the middle or the end of the tallow flow all the way through the end of your dearth until it starts getting cool and you can go in and treat them with formic acid or oxalic vapor or whatever you choose. That could be an incredibly valuable tool to you guys, but it's getting dismissed by some of the researchers because they're testing it and saying, well, it doesn't kill all of the mites, so it's not as good as all the other treatments. Well, maybe you don't need to kill them. Maybe you just need something that's really, really heat tolerant, and it does something to help. So, that's not an answer, and, I certainly don't want anyone to break the law, but I do hope that the law is able to catch up to what we're starting to learn about what beekeepers need and what these different miticides can do.
Thank you for tearing open yet another scab that has been the bane of so many of our existence. And I mean this respectfully. There's a great book. If you're into homesteading and farming, you know the name Joel Salatin. But everything I want to do is illegal. It's a great read. And if we are all being transparent, when it comes to beekeeping and animal husbandry, we have to do what's best for our bees. And most of the time, that is outside of the boundaries of what the label on something says. Now, I'm not saying you should go out to do that, but I'll be the first one to say 100% for a fact that my bee operation is operating illegally. And here's the reason why. Last year, to be operating legally, I should be applying these products according to the label on the bucket. Apigard, for instance, okay, under those time frames and thus and such. Well, in the situation that I found myself in, on 100 plus colonies or so, there was so much going on in life and the farm. I didn't get back out to that yard to pull those treatment shims off, to pull the cards off, to pull the product out. So what I found in those yards is that I had Apigard crystals, or Apigard that crystallized, sat in a card, sat in those colonies the entire winter long. Now that in and of itself is illegal.
Right.
But here's what happened. Every single one of those colonies survived beautifully through the wintertime and were highly producing colonies in the spring. The colonies that I did get back to and pulled those cards off of, they didn't fare so well. So while yes, there is the letter of the law and there's the labels, you pulled the scab off a very important point, that we have what we're told we're supposed to do and what is legal, and everyone's just supposed to follow suit. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there is so much context and nuance and scale to all of this. There is no one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. But I think if we take more responsibility for our context, for our scale, for our goals, for our bees in our own yard, then I think the ball starts to really start rolling and catching speed and momentum. Because when you have folks like Bruce who's asking a question, what do I do when it's this hot and it's this, you can find that person in that local area who's having success with something and open up that dialogue. Unfortunately, there's so many things that are working, that are successful, that are keeping bees healthy and alive, that are making these operations not only physically sustainable, but financially sustainable, that may or may not coincide with every letter and sentence on the label in a bucket.
Right. And what I will emphasize that my only official position is that every beekeeper should be following the law. But I think we have a problem like this, where we've got beekeepers who are doing these things because these are the things that we've determined are necessary to keep our bees alive and healthy. And we started doing that when varroa showed up, and there were few to no tools available to us, right? The mites showed up, there was maybe Apistan available, but we didn't have this whole suite of different chemicals and tools that we could use. So flying by the seat of our pants was the only thing the beekeepers could do to keep the bees alive. Up here, we've got what the beekeepers are doing. Down here, we've got what the law says beekeepers are supposed to do or allowed to do. And we've got a major problem because unless we can get the beekeepers to get rid of some of the weirdest and most eccentric things that we're doing, and if we can get the law to actually catch up with the science and catch up with the beekeeping and the husbandry so that we're in agreement, it means that necessarily a regulator has got to go to a beekeeper and say, no, you've got to come way down here and have your bees not survive as well. Or we've got to go to the regulators and say, hey, you've got to let us do whatever we want and not apply any control, and let us put whatever pesticides we want any day of the week onto our hives. Well, if they start letting us do that, they have to start letting the apple growers do the same thing. They have to start letting the soybean growers do the same thing. They can be spraying neonics or in the middle of the day or the middle of the bloom period, and that's not good for our bees either. So what we want is strong pesticide regulations, and that's the thing we're fighting against here. But they need to be smart pesticide regulations. We want them strong and enforced, but they've got to catch up with the best practices. So, for example, my new role here, my job at Betterbee, is as the director of research and education. And part of that, the sort of the research side and the product development side, is that I'm involved in our relationship with Chemicals Life. We're the manufacturers of Apibioxal, which is the only legal labeled oxalic acid product in the United States. The label says you should use 1 gram of oxalic acid vaporized per brood box in order to treat your bees. Well, Cameron Jack, Jennifer Berry, all sorts of scientists have done I think they've done some of that at Auburn as well. Folks have done great research that have shown that 1 gram per brood box does not provide as much mite control as 2 grams or 3 grams or 4 grams does. And in the EU and in Canada, you can use something like 2.3 grams because they've approved that higher dosage. But that's not what our label says. And so you've got to buy this legal product, and it gives you the instruction, but there's already good peer-reviewed scientific research saying, maybe that ought to be updated and changed. So the reason that I had an hour-long phone call with Cameron Jack today is that he and I are working now with the manufacturers through Betterbee, working with the manufacturers to apply to EPA to actually increase that dosage so that the law is going to become more in line with what the science is telling us our bees actually need. So as beekeepers, we need to admit that, maybe it's cheaper to go hire somebody to go to Mexico and illegally smuggle in a bunch of amitraz that I can put in my hives for cheaper than an Apivar strip. But we need to let some of that go while we're still lobbying to get them to catch up with their regulation. Because when we're all at the same point, then if we're all in complete agreement, we're following the law and the law knows what is best for bees. If some new discovery comes out, if we discover that an extended release oxalic acid pad is the thing that we all want to have approved next, we're right here, the regulators are right here, and we can work together to move up to that new treatment.
Way quicker. Yeah.
So we've got to get away from our sort of Wild West attitude, but we also have to, in doing that, we need to kind of, I don't want anyone going to jail, but we have to be honest about what we need to do to keep our bees alive. So that if they find out that following the law kills entire apiaries of bees, maybe that's the motivation that gets the EPA to go, oh, geez, all right, maybe we need to sit down and actually solve some of these problems.
That's a great point. And you know, this is where the conversation, bringing in different scales and context, is so crucial, because if and with respect to Brian's 11, if Brian loses 50% of 11, he can rebound. If Bruce or I or Bob Benny or Chris Warner loses 50% because of those bounds that whether we do or don't fall within, that's a different story. I think the most simplistic, easiest case in point in my mind to this whole, this isn't an argument but conversation, but the argument in the greater sphere is oxalic acid. Oxalic acid was that super weird thing on the fringe, and now most folks are using 1 to 5 grams and finding it to be extremely effective, and that is illegal by every stretch of the letter of the law right now, but that's what's being done, and that's what's keeping the bees alive. So there's a lot of nuance, and I like what you said there about bringing the two together. You know, is it ever going to get there? It would be grand that it does.
If we can only get closer, it'd be better.
There's always going to be a gap. Let's bring the gap closer, so that we can maybe move quicker. But I appreciate your transparency with that conversation, because it is definitely delicate, to say the least.
I think I really think that I sense Dr. Peck that you understand the pain. You've gone through it yourself somewhat, as far as just the rift or the you know, the schism that's there, just the break.
I'm a beekeeper. You know, I got to keep my bees alive too.
So we, you know, that's where we're all frustrated, but everyone in this chat just wants to keep their bees alive. And that's what it really boils down to. Nobody's trying to, and I think I think we're all kind of preaching to the choir here. I mean, we all are. We all understand what needs to happen. But, and you know, I'm fortunate to have some really good mentors that have shown me some things that work and down here. But I still am trying to figure it out. We all are. But we appreciate you coming on tonight, and we're going to have to continue this sometime, because I think we barely scratched the surface tonight. I mean,
the scabs got pulled. We're good.
Yeah, we got all the scabs pulled off. Now we need to come back. But I think your conversation about, you know, how to strategize, that is so important, because for you to say in the first week of May you should do this, and then in the first week of August you have to do this, and if you're in Texas you should do this. Now you can't. I mean, everybody manages their bees differently. Folks here in Alabama, like my neighbor, you know, if I've got a beekeeper, everybody does a little bit differently. But like you said, I think it's critical that you mentioned that you need to understand the products you're using and monitor before and after. And I've learned that from Greg actually this year, probably more than anybody, the importance of monitoring. I never really monitored my mites until this year, and I was pretty careful. I tried to do it, not every colony, but I monitored quite a few before and after almost every treatment time period or treatment regimen I did. I tried to monitor before and after, and it's been very educational with different products, some of which we've mentioned on here and some of which we've beat around the bush a little bit. But the effectiveness through that monitoring of those products, I've realized that maybe some things I thought were working maybe weren't as effective as I thought they were, and others were. And so that has helped me kind of be able to steer and focus a little better, maybe moving into the future. So I appreciate that, and it is super important.
Now, I do not want this to look like a shameless corporate plug. So I do work at Betterbee, and this is the Betterbee catalog, but I'm not showing it to you because I want to sell you anything. So in the Betterbee catalog, you know, there's plenty of pages that'll show you products and let you know what you can buy. But I have some control over it as the director of research and education. And it's not just me. It's the whole company has this philosophy of, you know, teach people how to keep their bees alive, and then they're going to keep coming back and buying hives from us year after year. So, you know, if you turn to your varroa treatment page, this is what you're going to find. You're going to find not just here's what it is and here's what it costs. It's going to be a whole series of instructions that are going to help you make the right choice about which varroicide is most effective. But the other thing is, if you turn to the middle section, there's sort of an orange stripe right down the middle. This is the beekeeping guide. This has got no products in it. It's got no prices in it. It is just us trying to teach people how to be better beekeepers. So we've got articles about inspections. We've got articles about swarming. This right here, this is a summary I wrote of varroa biology, an explanation of varroa management. This has all 3 methods that we recommend for doing varroa monitoring: sticky boards, sugar rolls, and alcohol washes, and it talks about some of the pros and cons. So these are resources that are available, and we will mail these to anybody who asks for them. So this is a bunch of stuff that folks can go through and actually just follow and say, hey, look, yeah, I didn't know that that was the recommendation from the Honeybee Health Coalition. You asked me if I would give you a varroa treatment recommendation. I kind of refused to do so. At the same time, right here, we've got sample plan for varroa management. This is not the plan for varroa management, but it's a plan. And every year we put a different plan out, and it's not because we think that the old one's bad and the new one's better. It's that we want to keep showing people that sort of that philosophy of, okay, well, in February I might put in an apivar strip, but then and then in April I'll pull them out. Then maybe Mother's Day I'm going to go in and I might test some colonies and use some Formic Pro. Maybe I'll use HopGuard if the Formic Pro is unnecessary, if that's too strong. And then maybe I'll do the same thing June, same thing in July, same thing in August. Then maybe in Labor Day I might put in some Apiguard or some Apilife VAR, one of those Thymol-based treatments. So this is something that works in a northern climate. It's going to be different timing and different temperatures for different regions. But we put all of these things in here just to emphasize that a normal, appropriate, healthy, successful varroa management plan is not, this is the best miticide, I'm going to use nothing but this. It's, I need to know all of the different miticides. I need to be monitoring and then using the right one when it's time to treat. And I can't tell you when it's time to treat your bees can, or your varroa mite population can. You only find that out when you monitor.
Great stuff.
I have, just so everybody knows, I have Betterbee's website. It will be in the description of this live stream. I have the YouTube channel as well. So all of that stuff is linked in the video, so it should be easy for anyone to find, their website and also their YouTube channel.
Yep, and we really are proud of that, particularly that YouTube channel. But I mean, we've got the website, we've got the newsletter that goes out every month. These are not commercials, right? Our goal is not to sell all of this stuff, because most of the time we're not talking about any particular product. It's, we've got an EAS master beekeeper who is our head beekeeper. I've got a Ph.D. in bee behavior. We've got veterinarians who own the place. So our goal here is to be good beekeepers and to share what's working with us. And only by doing that will people succeed enough that they and their friends and their kids and their grandkids are all going to decide to become beekeepers. And the hope is that they'll buy stuff from Betterbee instead of somebody else. But either way, we're happy to share the knowledge that we've been able to accumulate.
Dr. Peck, thanks for taking time out for us tonight as we close this this live chat. I wondered, this is a big year for a lot of us. What are you most excited about as we close out as we bring in 2023?
I think I'm finally going to have the time to organize and run a couple of research projects this coming year. I'm going to be looking at hive top insulation in summer and winter using the, among other things, the BeeSmart insulated inner cover. I think that's going to give us some chances to learn a little bit more about hive insulation. I've got a couple of varroa experiments in mind that I won't share the details on, but I think I'm going to have enough time between all my other duties to do a little bit of that. So any chance that I can learn more about bees, beekeeping, bee health, and then share that with people is my favorite way to spend a summer.
Awesome. Brian, what about you?
Oh, I wish we had about 6 more hours to keep this going, but we can't. But it's funny, and I won't go down the rabbit hole as far as talking about those insulated covers, but I switched over to those in my apiary, and my colonies are doing exceptional. So I think you'll like those when you do get them. But for this year, I tell you, I'm not even going to answer that question, Greg, because the hashtag
hashtag Brian 40, yeah.
Yeah, the hashtags are just going crazy. So if I say anything, the hashtags are going to start. So
if you get 11 out of 11 in spring, you're going to have to let them swarm or split them, and so
There'd be a 22 just like that.
Pretty easy way to double, if nothing
I didn't
else.
even want to think about that. I know. I was telling my wife that the other day because I had gone out just to check them the other day, and when I went home, I kind of had this look, and I said, "They're still sitting 11 for 11," and she said, "You're like upset over that," and I said, "You don't understand what the spring is going to be like."
Oh man, time to start
That's the
selling some
problem.
nukes, Brian.
The curse of becoming a good beekeeper is that suddenly you've got more bees than you ever wanted.
Yeah. So,
Bruce, what are you
23
looking forward to this year?
I'm still trying to just iron these things out and figure out what I want to do when I grow up. But I'm kind of getting a better idea. I think when the bees come back from, as we were talking tonight, actually just a couple of minutes ago, I thought that when the bees come back from California, it's such a busy time, it's time you can split them and do so much with those bees coming back. But I think one of the first things I'm going to do is set them down and just do some mite washes and see what that is. Because I really think there were some issues. Last year, I did not get those bees treated when they came back, and that's where I had my biggest loss. And so both the donor colonies and the splits I made off of them. And so I think I'm going to try to just even get better at monitoring and see if I can figure out a strategy through the summer that works a little better. It's just tough to do it all. I mean, it's so busy, but I'm going to try to grow some and try to just continue to grow the beekeeping knowledge, grow the beekeeping channel, Bruce's Bees, and also grow the beekeeping business here. And we may have some things kind of on the back burner and on the side. I'm trying to figure out how to I want to figure out how to be more, use that word again, intentional and efficient with my beekeeping, because I've got Tyler, my friend down there, who's got 1,000 colonies and works full time. And then I can barely keep 100 to 150 alive. And so I've got to figure out how to be more intentional. I do like to kind of watch the queen sometimes, but I do still have that wonder, but I don't do that much. I'm usually fairly efficient, but still I just can't seem to get it be as efficient as I need to be. And so that's kind of my goal, is to become more efficient and really continue just to hone in what I'm doing and get better at it, just to be better, a little better every day, a little better every year, and a little more effective as a beekeeper. And I think that's kind of what we're all trying to do in some respect.
And what you emphasize, that idea, I'll just jump in with one final thought, that the importance of getting data, of getting information from your colonies, because when they come in, if you don't monitor your mite levels, you can't make decisions without information. You can only make guesses, and you can make lucky guesses or unlucky guesses, but you don't want to be relying on luck in beekeeping. If you have data, if you actually monitor those mites, then you can make a good decision or a bad decision based on the information that you got. So I think that's what you're talking about with intentional beekeeping, is that you don't just want to sort of stumble through it. You want to learn something, and then based on what you've learned from those colonies, make the right management choices.
That's right. And just know what I'm doing. When I'm in the bees, what am I trying to do?
Right.
Have a goal, not just go out and just go through all the colonies, just
go do things.
Have a reason to be in there. And I used to, as a hobbyist, and as I've grown, and any new beekeepers or people that are thinking about getting into beekeeping, you have to do that. You have to just go get in them sometimes and learn the bees, learn from the bees. But when you're trying to grow and you're trying to really, just grow it almost as a business, or you're trying to grow your operation, sometimes you just have to go and get in the colonies, and you have to have a purpose for doing that. Whether it's assessing for splits, whether it's splitting, whether it's, treating for mites, assessing mite, whatever, you need to have a reason for going in the colony. Just to go out there and just get in them just to enjoy it, that's okay. But if you're trying to grow the business or grow the operation, sometimes that's not the best use of your time. And so it's just what I love about beekeeping, is that it's you never know. It's just, in some ways, it's a mystery. We're always things to figure out. Every hive, every community, every hive, every colony is its own organism, so to speak. So everyone's a little different, like people, different personality. But that's one of the most frustrating things as well, is the consistency is hard to attain. And that's kind of, it's cool, but yet it's very frustrating at the same time. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. That's what we're all trying to figure out, is how to just be better at what we're doing, in every aspect of our lives, but especially in this beekeeping thing.
Yeah.
Greg, what are you looking forward to?
Well, trying to do better, and I'm looking forward to finding ways to kind of tune up and be more mindful, aware, and growth management is something that's it's a great problem to have, and we're blessed to have it. So this year I'm looking forward to. Every year you push yourself, and you do things that you didn't think that you could do, and year after year of doing that, we're still at the same point right now where we're planning on all the nuke sales and the packages and the queens, in our supply shop. And there is a very bright future for beekeepers, for beekeeping. We can see that, and so we have to remind ourselves that every year it seems like we are pushing ourselves as far as we can, and we've always find a way to make it happen. It works out. That's kind of where we're at right now, is just taking the time right now when we can to remind ourselves that we just we dig in, we do the work, and we just try to manage that growth every single year. So this year I'm really looking forward to bringing a lot more folks into the fold, whether it's the folks that come pick up nukes and queens and supplies. I'm really excited about all the collaborations with like you and Corey and Nathan and all the folks at Hive Life. I'm looking forward to getting that interview series out on our Nature's Image Farm podcast and YouTube channel. And one of the things one of the little really, I don't want to say it's for me things that I'm really excited about, but my wife Susie and I are going to be doing Sunday night farm chats where we can just express and share the farm life aspect of it, which it totally does have to do with bees, but there's a lot more to it than just that. It's a much bigger picture on the time that we're gifted here on Earth. And so I'm looking forward to those Sunday night chats. I'm also really excited just to watch and follow what you do, Dr. Peck, with Betterbee, with your collabs, Brian and Bruce, all the folks that we're in contact with. It's just, like I said it before, but like the honeybee is to the hive, we're better together. And I think when we're in that kind of a mindset, when we're working together, we want to see everybody do well. We want to collaborate. We want to move and push this thing forward in a positive way. All the negativity, all the arguments, all the discourse just drops behind when we're focused on it being about the people and being about each other. I'm really excited to see what 2023 brings for all of us.
Yeah, excellent. Well, on that note, and I tell you, I hate to click the button to do this, but unfortunately, we're just watching the time and, let Dr. Peck get back to his family.
I got to be back in this office at 8:30 tomorrow. So
Oh my gosh.
Thank you for your time tonight. Really do appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And everybody, Greg always has the best words to end out a live stream. So I'm going to pass it on right up to Greg. See what I did there, Greg?
Well, I could spend all night here, but I want to thank Dr. Peck for taking the time out to keep these kind of conversations moving forward, where we're bringing the full picture, or at least a piece of the picture, into the same circle, to throw ideas around, to not only help each other think through some of these things, but it influences our thinking. There's things that we're planting seeds, whether we know it or not. And that's going to be a great way to see everyone grow. Like we said before, like the honeybee is to the hive, we're better together. So I want to thank everyone for listening, tuning in. Dr. Peck, thanks to you and Betterbee for what you do, taking the time out for us. And like I always say, as always, remember to be the lighthouse and be the change that you want to see in this world. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.